episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Machon Netzach Yaakov. This episode is also sponsored in honor of Yoshua Reuben's birthday on Chof Daled Nisan, wishing him good health, nachas from his family, and a continued thirst for knowledge on Me'ah V'Esrim. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can find a link and more information in the show notes below. You can also find a link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and so on, as well as a link to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status if you prefer things that way. And finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you listen, and rate and review if you listen on Apple. And with that, enjoy the episode. This second episode in the mini-series about Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, focused on his Teshuvah Svarim, Teshuvah Me'ava, and the new forthcoming edition published by Machon Netzach Yaakov, as well as the brand new volume on Even Ezer, published for the first time from manuscript. So stay tuned for that, which will be coming out in the coming months. With that, enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and the second episode in the series about Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, the Baal Mechaber, Sefer Teshuvah Me'ava, and other Svarim. On this episode of the series and of the podcast, we'll be discussing the Teshuvah Me'ava exclusively, his magnum opus, and this episode and this mini-series is sponsored by Machon Netzach Yaakov, who has published the Svarim of Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, and now they were Zaycha to print the Teshuvah Me'ava in its entirety, including the new volume on Even Ezer from manuscript, which is, again, a very, very chashuv thing. And this is the 200th yard side of Elazar Fleckles, as mentioned on episode 1. And so a thank you to Machon Netzach Yaakov for sponsoring this episode, and a real thank you and yashar to them for publishing the Teshuvah Me'ava in this wonderful, beautiful new edition. This episode of the podcast and of the series, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Moshe Tobal, who is a Maggid Shir and a Reish Kollel in West Deal Synagogue in Deal, New Jersey, and a friend of mine, and a real Teshuvah Me'ava, Rabbi Elazar Fleckles aficionado. So thank you, Rabbi Moshe, for joining me.
Yes, I feel it's a great privilege to join Rabbi Nachi in his podcast over here, and it's a great privilege to be speaking about the Teshuvah Me'ava, someone who I feel very close to, his works, his Svarim, his life. Since I was a young boy, I always enjoyed learning the Svarim of the Teshuvah Me'ava, especially Sefer the Teshuvahs of the Teshuvah Me'ava, and his style of writing is so beautiful and so woven with words of Chachamenu Rabbi Seinu, and he brings out the points that he's saying very beautifully, and it's very enjoyable to read all his Svarim, to learn any of his Svarim, especially his drush, which brings so much joy to the person who reads it, with clarity of hashkafa, which is unbelievable. So it's a privilege for me to speak about the Teshuvah Me'ava and about his work of the Teshuvah Me'ava.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start off, Ramesh, if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So, I grew up in a school which was a little bit out of the box. So I was always, into, not the regular things that, in the regular yeshivish schools they're into. I was always into researching everything and, not just, taking everything at face value. And eventually I took that to, Mesifta and later into Beis Medrash, and even through Beis Medrash Gavoya. I like to, research everything and understand it with its full clarity and depth. And therefore I really appreciate the Svarim of Chachmei Prague, which I feel that they had this shleimus and this understanding from all angles. They had a very broad chinuch, and Mela, that gives more of a depth to when they say a svar or when they say something. It's with a certain clarity that I enjoyed from the Chachmei Prague. Even, I really was inspired by the works of the Noid B'Yehuda, and that's how I got to the Teshuvah Me'ava. So I really got into the Noid B'Yehuda, where his works, his teshuvas, especially his teshuvas, his drushes, and everything that he wrote, I really enjoyed his works and his the way he presents it and everything. But once I started going into the works of the Noid B'Yehuda, I started getting into his Talmidim, and that's how I came to the Teshuvah Me'ava. I really enjoyed everything that I saw by the Teshuvah Me'ava and David Deitch and Bitzal Ranchberg and all his other Talmidim, to mention a few. And I really appreciated what I saw there. That's not really so much, the run-of-the-mill, like they say, the regular in the box. They have more of a well-rounded view and presentation of what they say.
Yeah, and the Teshuvah Me'ava specifically is interesting. And as you mentioned, the Prague is always interesting. They're different. And I mentioned on the first episode that the Rabbi Yehuda actually was Polish. But the Talmidim you're mentioning in Elazar Fleckles are real Pragians. Elazar Fleckles is a miyuchis of Prague. So these are real, it's different. It's a little different, and you can see that from reading about Elazar Fleckles' Svarim that he's from Prague and he's not Polish. I think it's thicker.
That is true. You could see that, but you do see the strong influence of the Rabbi Yehuda on the Teshuvah Me'ava. You would see that there's a big difference actually between the Shivas Tzion. The way I understand, again, I should say a disclaimer before we start talking. Two things. One thing is that, of course, everything that I'm going to say is the way I see it. But every gadol has many different ways of looking at him. Every gadol is tremendous. Every gadol is way beyond our comprehension. We can't really understand him or describe him properly. But this is the way I understand it, the way I see it from the Sfarim, the things that he wrote, the drushes that he said. This is the way I understand it. But everyone, is not meshubah to take it the way I see it. The second disclaimer is that I'm going to say what I remember mikufya, from what I remember from learning the Svarim, not from, being able to go into the sugya as of now. So therefore, if I made any mistakes, you could blame me because I am not in the sugya. So the difference between the Shivas Tzion and the Chachmei Prague, I find that the way he brings the pilpul into halacha, I find that more prevalent by the Shivas Tzion, even more prevalent than in his father's sefer of the Noid Behuda. Yes, in Drush V'Chidush, and Derish L'Tzion, he does have regular Polish pilpulistic drushes, and he calls them drushes, but really they are essays in halacha. But when it comes to halacha, I think the Noid Behuda is a little bit more toned down with the pilpul, even though he does have, some Polish influence. When it comes to halacha, there's only slight flashes of pilpul will they bring it in, but in their chidushim on Shas, and you see once in a while, like I'm saying, they bring it in once in a while, you do see that they did have the pilpul, probably because of the influence of the Noid Behuda. So the way I understand it is that although the Noid Behuda was, yes, he was, from Polish, he was from Poland, and he was, he had the Polish Mahalach, more like Tushtel and this and that. However, I would suggest that he did have a strong influence on his Talmidim, and they did get influenced from his pilpulistic. However, when it came to halacha, I think they took what he did a little bit more. They were a little bit more, down on the pilpul. Masha Enk and the Shivas Tzion, I think, is a little bit more up on the pilpul, even when it comes to halacha. And that's what I have to say about Dr. Klemper's essay on the machlekes between the Teshuvah Me'ava and Reb Shmuel Landau, that he wants to say that Reb Shmuel Landau was more into pilpul and the Teshuvah Me'ava was more of a bucky, which I have no way of telling one way or another, but I do know that it is not exactly correct and accurate that the Teshuvah Me'ava did not have pilpul, because he had a sefer called Alim, which we don't have in print today. He had a few svarim that we don't have in print that are in Ksav Yad. Either they have it, they don't have it. But one of the svarim are called Alim, where he had, long pilpulim, and he refers to it throughout the Teshuvah Me'ava and his other svarim. And other things that he says that I said lechadude talmidim, and they were regular fartige pilpul shtiklach, which you would find in Derish L'Tzion or any other Polish sefer. But when it came to halacha, yes, he was more toned down. So therefore, this Dr. Klemper could have got that impression. But I don't think that there's any proof that Shmuel Landau was more Charif than the Teshuvah Me'ava, or the Teshuvah Me'ava was more of a bucky than Reb Shmuel Landau. It was just the way they style themselves in their Sfarim.
So a couple of things to add on there. Reb Shmuel Landau, you're referring to that, but you said Shivas Tzion is Reb Shmuel Landau. He is the Noid Behuda's B'malam HaKoyim to some extent. He takes over for the Noid Behuda.
He also has many Teshuvas in the Noid Behuda.
Correct. He's the editor, the publisher of the Noid Behuda. There's many Teshuvas, and oftentimes you hear people quote a certain Noid Behuda. It's not really Noid Behuda, Shmuel Landau. And Shivas Tzion has his own Teshuvah sefer. Very Shaltzin, you mentioned the Pilpul. We mentioned the first episode. That's the Noid Behuda's sefer of pilpul, drush pilpul. It's not really drushes as sermon. Right. It was real heavy pilpul. Pilpul's another topic. One day, Mitzvah Hashem, hopefully do an episode on that, on pilpul and what real pilpul, old style pilpul was. Now, as you mentioned there, something else that you mentioned was the machlekes. Something we didn't really touch that episode a little bit. I even want to mention it before we get to Shmei Ava. So, as I mentioned in episode 1, after the death of the Rabbi Yehuda, there kind of was like a rotating, or the Av Bezin was the Elazar Fleckles and Rosh Lando. There was a machlekes, and there was no Rav. I believe the next chief rabbi after Rabbi Yehuda was Shir.
Yes.
Rabbi Yehuda Rappaport, the Ksaisis Edim, the big Maskilim, was the next chief rabbi in Prague. Yes. But that was a long time. It was decades of nobody. Now, there was an Av Bezdin, and the Av Bezdin functioned. The Ravid functioned as a Rav, but chief rabbi, there was nobody
vacant,
filled. Correct. The vacant office until you get to Shir. And there was a machlekes.
It possibly could be that Shir reestablished that office. It could be it was bottle, it was null, and then reestablished in the times of Shir. I don't know how it worked. But you're right that there was a vacant office of the chief rabbi after the Rabbi Yehuda. Could be possibly because of the machlekes, that's why it happened, or it was just bishum kvoida of the Rabbi Yehuda. We find a similar thing in Vilna. After the Tana Teshuvah was nifter, there was no rabbi of Vilna anymore, and it was just the head of the Bezdin that was the one who ran the town. Like Reb Chaim Ozer was not the Rav of Vilna; he was the head of the Bezdin. When I say the Tana Teshuvah, I mean Reb Shmuel Avigdor. He was the last and final Rav of Vilna. There was a massive machlekes between him and the Vilna Gaon about his office of being Rav. After he was nifter, the office became bottle. So it could be because of the machlekes, it could be other reasons, bisham kvoidai of the Rabbi Yehuda. But whatever the case is, after the Rabbi Yehuda was nifter, a massive machlekes ensued, who should be taking over the place of the Rabbi Yehuda. Most apparently supported the Teshuvah Me'ava, and there were that supported the Rishmul Landau. Gnozim actually had an auction, the most recent auction. They had a multiple page Teshuvah from Rishmul Landau to the Teshuvah Me'ava, explaining his position, why he should be the chief rabbi or whatever, take over the position of his father. However, we know that Rabbi Chiatlis weighed in on the issue. He was one of the Dayanim. He was actually the Bur, and he was basically the main one to push the Teshuvah Me'ava. That's what it sounds like. And it's what's interesting, and I love to point this out all the time, that although he was the one who pushed Elazar Fleckles into the office, he does not favor him in his teshuvas, and you'll see that he very sharply criticizes him sometimes when he feels he made a mistake. That means when the Teshuvah Me'ava had a Shiloh from a Baruch Yetlis where he suggests a certain mahalach in a Gemara or something like that, you see that the Teshuvah Me'ava does not favor him, and he'll very sharply argue on him, nicely but sharply. And, he doesn't favor at all the fact that he was the one who got him to his exalted position of, basically the one who's running the city of Prague, like practically the rabbi of Prague. And you see that he was, kol kula l'shem shamayim. He didn't mean, because he wanted the covet, or he wanted, Shmuel Landau wanted, it wasn't a fight of covet over here. It was more of a fight of mahalchim, of how to lead the city, because Reb Shmuel Landau was more open-minded, and I guess, the Teshuvah Me'ava felt that was like a little sakana, especially in Prague, where there was a lot of haskalah flying around over there. And Reb Shmuel Landau felt that he could go with more, pshara deka, and maybe that will make shalom with the haskalah, and maybe you'll be able to integrate both, and therefore it won't be so much of a sakana. It could be there was two mahalchim how to run the city. That's my own theory. That's the way I understood it.
And it's to some degree ironic, as you mentioned, those behind the Elazar Fleckles, or Baruch Yetlis and his brother Rabbi Yehuda Yetlis, were big maskilim. They were very involved in the Haskalah movement. Yeah. These were, they wrote in Hamasef, and they wrote Maskilik Sfarim, and so they were, that's just an aside. That
was actually a point that did bother me. What I did think to say for that was that it could be that the glory of the Teshuvah Me'ava's speech just blew them away, and they were just swept off their feet. Or, it could be that the Teshuvah Me'ava was more of a personable person that was very, he's very nice and lovable person. I'm not saying that the Shiva Tzion was mean. I'm not saying that. Chas v'shalom. I'm just saying that it could be that he was more better of a people's person, and that's why the Maskilim got along better with him than with someone who's more open-minded, believe it or not.
Yeah, listen, we don't know, but as I said, we do know that the next chief rabbi of Prague was a big maskil. By the way, everyone, Shir is an aside. One day we'll do an episode on Shir. That Shir is, if you look at Shir, he looks like Chassid's Rebbe with his big beard and pious, and he looks much like a Rebbe, but, he's obviously not a Rebbe. Okay, let's turn to the Teshuvah Me'ava, the topic at hand, the topic of this podcast, and the beautiful new edition by Mechonas Yaakov, the Sefer Teshuvah Me'ava. Sefer Teshuvah Me'ava, so it was, as we had it, was printed first 1809, I think, then 1815, 1822, somewhere around there. And obviously there's also the new volume in Even Ezra that's in Ksav Yad that's being printed for the first time now, which we knew about. Didn't know its whereabouts for a long time, but we knew it existed. Maybe there's even some others, but Even Ezra we knew existed for sure. Okay, let's talk about...
So we have also a documentation of Choshe Mishpat in Simin Reish Ayin Ches. He quotes Teshuvah Me'ava and Choshe Mishpat. So we definitely had a fifth volume of Teshuvah Me'ava.
So Teshuvah Me'ava is a halacha sefer to a degree. It's a tshuva sefer, and Teshuvah Sfarim are a genre, an interesting genre. For those familiar with Teshuvah Sfarim, we could talk about Bechlal Shas Teshuvahs, but Teshuvah Me'ava is a unique tshuva sefer. It's not your classic, typical, regular, and as evidenced by the first tshuva about Piyut, which goes on and on and on and on and on. Very many tshuvas you open up and it's like a shaila. There was a halacha question in the town, and so-and-so wrote a shaila to the Rav, and the Rav wrote this dance, and halacha is a psak. That is not what this is doing. A lot of Teshuvah Me'ava is hagois as well. Hagois and Shulchan Aruch, and we'll get to that. It's definitely a unique Teshuvah Sefer. So let's first tell the listeners about Teshuvah Me'ava, the Sefer, the structure, the style. Let's discuss Teshuvah Me'ava before we dive in some of the fascinating Teshuvahs and the fascinating examples there is to talk about in the Sefer.
So the way I understand the structure of the Teshuvah Me'ava is the first volume, he has more Teshuvahs. Not more, he has Teshuvahs. Some are lengthy, some are short. Some are lengthy, some are short. But, he also divides his simanim more by topics than by question and answer, meaning that if he had a question with many topics, he'll divide it into many simanim. And also, his simanim run through all his svarim, meaning Chelik Beis picks up the siman from where he left off in Chelik Aleph, although the style was very different. The style in Chelik Aleph, like I mentioned, was on 4 chalakim of Shulchan Aruch, and he just has simanim and just tshuvas. In Chelik Beis, he decided to do something else. And apparently he was planning to do this with all the 4 chalakim of Shulchan Aruch. We only were zeiche to have, as of now, Arachayim and Yeridea. And now we're privileged, Baruch Hashem, to be zeiche to the chelik on Even Ezra. And like I mentioned before, there was a chelik on Choshe Mishpat, like we see in Siman Reish Ayin Ches. He quotes Choshe Mishpat. There's other places as well, but that's just off the top of my head, whatever written down, where we have Choshe Mishpat quoted. So what he did in Chelik Beis, which is on Arachayim, was he decided to take his Gilyonis from his own Shulchan Aruch, Taz, Magen Avram, and Sma, well, in Choshe Mishpat, Sma, and over here, I'm assuming it'll be Chelkas Mechaking Beishmuel, and he put them on throughout the Sefer, as he moves through the Simanim of the Shulchan Aruch, he puts his tshuvas in between his hagoyis of the Shulchan Aruch. Meaning, if let's say he gets up to Siman Chavav, and he has a tshuva pertaining to that siman, he'll stick in the tshuva over there. And another interesting thing he did in Chelik Beis, which he didn't keep up so much in Chelik Gimel, which was on Yeridea, was at the end of every halacha, let's say, at the end of Hilchas Tefillah, he'll have a nice short drush, which ties into the halacha and sums up the halacha and the drush pertaining to the halachas that we just learned. So let's say by Hilchas Tefillah, by Hilchas Brachas, he'll have a beautiful drush, like a short drush, with the halacha tied up with a Rambam, being miyashav a kasha on a Rambam, all beautifully packaged up at the end to sum up sort of like a siyum on the halacha that we were learning until then. In Chelik Gimel, he does it sometimes, not always. So that was just another interesting point that he does. Also, this is not specifically by the Teshuvah Me'ava, but he does have a lot of things, a lot of tshuvas that are not halacha l'maisa, meaning they are negea to Yemaisa Mashiach, to Mantaira, and actually the last tshuva in Chelik Aleph, he talks about Be'ita and Achishana. He doesn't understand how we could say Achakale B'chol Yom Sheyavoi if the Gemara says clearly that he's going to Benisan Asid and Legal. Well, now we're in the we're in the spirit over here. We're coming up for Rosh Chodesh Nisan on Thursday. So he says Asid in the Goel or B'Tishrei Asid in the Goel, depending if you hold like a Rishu or Elazar. So he says, I don't understand, and he brings a question from the Gemara that says that if a person makes a neder Shabbat ben David, he's usher in all the things a Nazir is usher, except for this and Erev Yom Tif. So he says, I don't understand. It should either be in Nisan or either be in Tishrei. How do we get this to be every day of the year? So he answers a very fascinating answer. He says that the Rambam says that there's going to be a Mashiach coming, and he will then be Mashiach Klal Yisrael. And therefore, the Geula is not the day that Mashiach comes. Mashiach will come first, and then he will be, with Hashem's help, he will be Mashiach us, and then we will be Nigol, and that will either be in Tishrei or Nisan. So Yom Sheben David Gba could come any day, but the Geula will happen either in Nisan or in Tishrei when Mashiach succeeds in fighting off all the enemies and building the Beis HaMikdash. So he definitely has, tshuvas that are Negeya Tagadata and Negeya to Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash and Negeya to all these different things. He was not Meshubah to be talking about halacha. And a lot of times I find also that he puts a lot of his personal life into the tshuvas. He was very personable the way I understood him to be. Again, this is my understanding. He's very personable and he was very friendly. And you'd see in the tshuvas, he would tell the person what he's going through now. I'm going through a hard time. I had a stroke, or, I'm in tiplets, or, this past week was very hard. One place he says, I was chased out of my house because they made it into a sukkah. Apparently, it looked like they made his svarim room into a sukkah. I guess they rolled off the roof and made it into a sukkah. In one of the tshuvas, he mentions that. Different things about his personal life you see throughout the Sefer. This is not special about the Teshuvah Me'ava, a lot of the Mechabrim, but I feel that he is a little more personable, and he talks about himself a little more, not in a derech gaiva chas v'shalom, talking about his personal life more than other mechabrim.
But you mentioned templates. That's because in Bohemia, the hot springs, this is somewhere they would go if you weren't feeling. Yes, but that's where you would go. So that's the thing, as you mentioned, you could see that personable person coming through. And as you, that was a beautiful example to illustrate the Teshuvah Me'ava, how unique he was and how interesting. Like we said, the first one is about Piyat. There's going to be one about, not one. He has many comments about the Zayir. We'll talk about the Zayir. And the Zayir Teshuvah is written to his very good close friend, Carolus Fisher, who is the non-Jewish censor of Jewish
non-Jewish, not a maskil, not a frayid. He was a goy.
He was not Jewish,
Christian goy.
But he wrote and understood fluent Hebrew. Rabbi Elazar Fleckles is, by all accounts, his friend, legitimately his friend, and so he has Teshuvah, and we'll talk about that Teshuvah and his comments on the Zayir, which are in multiple places, including Avos David and other places, which we'll talk about in the third episode, by the way, but and others. So, just right away, I think you can understand the difference between a regular Teshuvah Sefer. But let's just emphasize a little more. The Teshuvah Me'ava's Rabbi, the Rabbi Yehuda, has one of the most important, greatest of all time, if you will, Teshuvah Sfarim, Rabbi Yehuda. So let's just take the Rabbi Yehuda as an example. Compare the Rabbi Yehuda as a Sefer, as not the Rabbi Yehuda himself, but the Sefer Rabbi Yehuda as a Teshuvah Sefer to the Teshuvah Me'ava, just to compare and contrast the two, to illustrate for the listener the differences between the two, because they are different.
So I said a little before about how the Teshuvah Me'ava is less on the pilpul, and the Rabbi Yehuda has more harifas in there. That is true. The main difference that I saw, again, this is my understanding, the main difference I saw between the Rabbi Yehuda and the Teshuvah Me'ava is that the Rabbi Yehuda was a master Bal Masber. Not that the Teshuvah Me'ava was not, but that his hasbara was just phenomenal. It's out of this world. He could teach you the most complicated things in a Teshuvah and bring it down to your level. The Teshuvah Me'ava he could have done that, but he doesn't. If you're not a Talmud Chacham, and you're reading a Teshuvah from the Teshuvah Me'ava, he's referencing you Kol HaTorah Kula in one Teshuvah, and you're going to feel lost and like you're missing out on the main part of the Teshuvah.
Just to jump in, another reason says anything else why a new edition was necessary with all the sources and done properly. But okay, keep going.
And what you're saying now is, I found that when I learned Teshuvah Me'ava, there are multiple printing mistakes throughout the Teshuvah Me'ava. Since he has so many sources, it's so easy to make these mistakes. And I was even able to figure out why the printers made these mistakes, because confusion of all the sources that they were being fed when they were printing.
Another thing that's interesting with Teshuvah Farm as a whole is who they were writing, who they were engaging with, who were they talking to, their friends, others. I mentioned Carl Fisher. Like who are the shalos? So, in general, in the Teshuvah Me'ava, who are the shalos, and the teshuvas with?
So, a lot of the teshuvas were written to his talmidim. You see different talmidim that wrote him. He had a very good relationship with his talmidim. This Teshuvah Me'ava that I have in front of me was actually a Talmud bought it from him. He says, Kanisi mihayni ba'adayni ma'ivira. He had a very, very good relationship with his Talmidim, and you see he writes to them all the time, and he's mechanech them and the svaris, and they're saying good, he says they're saying good. If they're saying bad, he says they're saying bad. But again, everything was done with ava, Teshuvah Me'ava, and with the right balance of chinuch and criticism and love. You see also the Noid Yehuda himself, when he writes a tshuva, he'll write very sharply to him. But again, he has that balance of love and chinuch, of criticism and love when he writes his tshuva to the Teshuvah Me'ava. Another thing I noticed also, this is just a side thing, that I don't recall seeing the Noid Yehuda write on any of his Talmidim Hagoin. Never. Not on David Deitch, not on the Teshuvah Me'ava, not any other ones. Not even Betzalel Ranchberg. Never saw him write on any Talmud Hagoin. He would write Harav, Hagodol, Hamushlam, write all nice things about them, but never write Hagoin. It could be it was his way of Zroik Mora B'Talmidim. I'm not really sure what he meant to do with that. But again, there was always a good relationship between the Noid Yehuda and his Talmidim, and you see that passed on from the Teshuvah Me'ava to his Talmidim. So he has a great deal answering with his Talmidim. You also see a major amount of teshuvas were written to his son-in-law, Itzik Spitz of Kalin. He wrote a tremendous deal back and forth. He even quotes at one point that he was learning Teshuvah Me'ava together with his son Yamtiv Spitz, who actually wrote the Zichron Eliezer. I'm sure you mentioned that.
Elazar.
Yes, Elazar. I'm sure you mentioned that in the first episode. It's interesting that you're correcting me about Elazar and Eliezer. His name was Elazar Fleckles. That's what for sure it was. There is an interesting thing, because in the preface to Oilas Chodesh, he says that he called it Oilas Chodesh because Chodesh is gematria his name, Eliezer. He does say that. But in the Teshuvah Me'ava, he says that the gematria of the Teshuvah Me'ava is his name, Elazar, and both do not work the other way. Elazar cannot be Eliezer, and Eliezer, it's just too much off. It's not like you could do it with mispar or whatever with a koilel. There's no way to work it out. So apparently, he saw it in some way one name. The Beis Shmuel does talk about a Elazar who is called Lazer and a Lazer that's called Elazar. Sorry, Elazar, real person whose real name is Elazar, who's called Lazer, and someone whose real name is Eliezer, and he's called Lazar. The Beis Shmuel does talk about that. It could be that was the case with the Teshuvah Me'ava as well. So that's just a side thing. But yes, his name was definitely Elazar. That's how he signs all his teshuvas, and I think that was written on his matzeva as well. Anyways, getting back to what we're talking about, he also had teshuvas to, Reb David Deitch had asked him. We see in the Teshuvah Me'ava, Reb David Deitch asked him, who was also a Talmud of the Noid Yehuda. Then he has teshuvas with Rabbi Ranchberg. Rabbi Ranchberg was one of the younger Talmidim of the Noid Yehuda. That's the way I understand it. Could be I'm wrong. He was one of the younger, meaning at the end of the Noid Yehuda's life. Apparently, when the Noid Yehuda was nifter, he adopted the Teshuvah Me'ava to be like his Rebbe almost. The way he refers to him is more with deference, like to a Rebbe. He has teshuvas, like we said before, to Rabbi Baruch Yetlis. He has teshuvas to Rabbi Fol Altshuler. He has teshuvas to Rabbi Shmuel Kaider, the Oila Shmuel, and he has teshuvas to the Or Chodosh, Rabbi Eliezer from Kalin, and he has teshuvas to many of the Gdolim of that time, the Rav of Frankfurt. He has many different teshuvas to all different Gdolim.
I want to mention, you mentioned the Oila Shmuel. Machon Etzichak is working on Shal Shuvas El Shmuel New Edition and El Shmuel Mixaviad. So
that's beautiful. That would be a great thing for the Torah world. That would be a great thing for the Torah world. There's so much treasures. You know, the Mishnah Berurah quotes the El Shmuel, and people don't know who he's talking about. There's many Sfarim the Mishnah Berurah quotes, and the people don't know what he's talking about. But it would be a great privilege for the Torah world to have such the Sefer back in print. Of course, I'm Zeicha to have the actual first print of the Sefer. I don't think it was ever reprinted, believe it or not.
So we also mentioned, obviously, just to go back to it, Carl Fisher, it's just jarring. So there's a Teshuvah, like in a Teshuvah Sefer written to a non-Jew. You don't usually be like, and as a Teshuvah, it's like a shell of a Teshuvah, it's like a Mazel. We have other letters, but
this was not the only Teshuvah. He has a Teshuvah about Nittelnach.
Famous Teshuvah.
He has a Teshuvah about Nittelnach where Carl Fisher asked him about, I think he asked him about playing cards on Nittelnach. And the Teshuvah Me'ava did answer him. The question is, did he mean what he said or did he not mean what he said? He said more like, he said that, no, he said, Batlanim always battle and like people that learn always learn. Or something to that extent. It's like he said you shouldn't get too disturbed by people playing cards on Nittelnach. That's not a real thing. He said it's people just getting excused to something to that extent. Like, I don't remember Clore what he said. I would have to look it up again, but I think it was something to like, you shouldn't get too disturbed by these sites because people that battle and people that learn, something to that extent.
Okay, I think now we should turn to some of the content. I know we've mentioned some examples, but especially the Piyut one. It's quite a long tshuva in the original for sure, in the new one. And it's an important tshuva, and it's very unique and interesting. So, Moshe, I'll let you we'll talk about the first tshuva on Piyut.
So, the shoyl was his student, Reb Ever from, I think his Negelshal is Nun Shin. I think that was the way to refer to Negelshal. Negelshal was a Prague family. They wrote the Sefer Beersheva, yes. He actually gave Haskama to Beersheva. So that was his student. And he asked him, he said, we see a lot of people attacking the Kalir. Rabbi Elazar Kalir, and he said the new Medaktikim, people that are great Medaktikim, they're being malagleg on the Divrei Kalir, so he asked his Rebbe's opinion what he has to say about this. And the Teshuvah Me'ava opens up his Teshuvah very strongly attacking seemingly the Haskalah, Diktuk movement of that time, saying that they have no Messiah and they don't know what they're talking about, and if they're deviating from, what the Rishonim say, then you can't be semech on what they're saying. He says that they're going on their miskolos harishonos. They're going on their he said that I'll read you the lashon that he says. He says, this dar kol echad boine bon mal atzmoi umakrav olav ish asher yidvenu liboy v'nivs fasayim, because a bummy could be makrav ish asher yidvenu, right? You could do whatever you want. Besides for chiyuvim, rather do loy having mum humaktir. They bring mum and they bring it kol sa'or v'chol dvash hamosik lefiv. Anything that he decides that it's nice, he just brings it on there. Basically, he's saying there was no care for Messiah and no care for trying to justify what they saw before, and they're just whatever they see fit. That's what they say and that's what they hold. That was basically what was going on with this new wave of Haskalah, and we know he was not too happy with them, shall we say. So that's how he starts off the tshuva. Then he goes on and he says that I'm not, so upset at the one who makes fun of the Kalir, who was Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra. He said, I'm more upset at the one who sees the Divrei HaMalagleg and sees the Divrei HaKalir, and he could see how the Divrei HaKalir is so klar and so geschmack and so built on the words of Chazal. And he says that Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra attacks him for the fact that he built his words on the Chazal. He said that's the biggest shvach you could get, the biggest compliment you could give him is the fact that his words were built on Chazal. And he says, and his lashon is great and everything is so good about it. He said, so how could you praise the Malagleg? Now, I'm going to go a little out of order. Later on in Ois Yud, at the beginning, he seemingly attacks Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra for his attitude, in general to different Gedolim and his Pirush al Torah. And he says the Ramban attacked him, and he quotes one of the Lashonos of the Ramban, which is a very sharp one, where he says where the Ramban says, I will pour molten gold down this Chacham's throat. So he goes on to say how the Rishonim, the ones that were more, the ones more later, he does bring that Tosfos, does quote Ibn Ezra with a lot of shvachim and was very, praising the Rebbe from Ibn Ezra. He brings the Rambam but he brings a lot of tightness that the other Rishonim had, and he does bring the Marshal, the famous Marshal in the beginning, the preface to Baba Kama, and the preface to Chulin. And however, he does end off and he says, everyone has to be very careful. B'chol zois, I'm going to read you the Lashon. He says, you can never take the words of the Rishonim, one against the other, and say, all right, look how they, let's say, sharfed him out. So we should not accept what he's saying. He's saying, if the Rishonim attacked Ibn Ezra for what he said, Ibn Ezra's, we have to accept what he says. Okay, maybe we can't be saimach on it because we don't understand it. And what the Ramban says, okay, he goes on to say, he says, we're not going to accept the words of the Rif because the Razah argued on him. We're not going to accept the words of our great Rebbe, the Rambam. He said the Ravid argued on the Rambam very sharply, and still we accept the Rambam and we accept the Ravid. He said, these sharp lashonis that the Rishonim had from one to another, he said only a fool gets influenced by these lashonis. He said a person has to know how to separate the attitude, I don't want to call it attitude, but the attack that they had on each other and the conversation more than the teichen that they're saying. He says the chacham takes the idea and the tipish takes the hak, let's say. So that's what he does say. He does stress that. So then after that, after saying that he doesn't appreciate someone who could see both and picks to side with attacking the Kalir, he goes on to describe who Rabbi Elazar Kalir is. And he first starts off by saying that Rabbi Elazar Kalir is Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon. And he brings from Tosfos and the Rosh that he was from Kiryas Sefer, and he was Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon. So he's saying we could assume that Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon is a Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon bar Yochai. So therefore, he's saying you can therefore disregard, he says, what the Madani Melech. It's very interesting because there's the famous story with the Taisus Yom Tiv when he got malshened on, right? There's the whole Megillus Eva because he called it Madani Melech. So they say, oh, he's making a rebellion. So it's funny because in the beginning he calls it Madan. He calls it the name that they had to change it to. He calls it Madani Yom Tiv. And then a few lines later, he calls it Madani Melech. He's back to the original title. So he's back and forth between the titles of what to call the Sefer. But he says you could disregard what he says because if it's Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon, then it just doesn't work out with what he's saying. Then he goes on to say the godless of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. He brings all different members of Chazal, how great he was, and therefore, if Rabbi Elazar ben Kalir is Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon, you cannot make light of what he says. But then he says, whether you accept that he's Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon bar Yochai or someone else, he says, one thing is for sure, he has to be before Rabbi bar Nachmani, because he is under the impression that Rabbi bar Nachmani was the one who, that was the way he understood, that Rabbi bar Nachmani was the one who made the Medrash Rabbis. There's a massive, discussion who actually made the Medrash Rabbah. But he is under the impression that the Medrash Rabbah was made by Rabbi bar Nachmani, and he says that over there's a mention of Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon, whether it's Rab Shimon bar Yochai or whether it's someone else, and he says Tanoi Paiton v'Darshan, and he says there's a different girsa in the Medrash that says, so he says according to that girsa, it's more clear that he made the Krovitz, and therefore he's saying that this would be Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon, and the Medrash Rabbah is talking about him, say obviously it had to be before. But he said even if you say that it's Darshan, he says that the Aruch seems to connect Darshan with Krovitz, and he says also it's Masha from Taisus and the Rosh that Darshan is Meloshin Krovitz, so therefore it would also be as well that the Medrash Rabbah is talking about this Rabbi Elazar ben Rab Shimon, so he had to be before Rabbi bar Nachmani. That's what he's bringing in the next segment. The next Ois, and Ois Daled, he goes on to say that the Sefer Yuchsin has an opinion, and the Rashba holds this way in Teshuvah, that he was not Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, he was Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. And he says, what does he do with this Medrash Rabbah? So he says, it sounds like from the Rashba that he had a different girsa, and his girsa was Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. Later on in the Teshuvah, where he brings down the Teshuvah Sarashba, I think it was Ois Nuntes, yeah.
It's Nuntes, just to get a flavor of how long this first Teshuvah is.
Yeah. So in Ois Nuntes, he does bring down the Teshuvah Sarashba, and it sounds like he was Geris in the Gemara, in the Medrash Rabbah, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. However, he says besides for that, he says it could be the reason why. He says we don't find that Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch made it a piyutim. So he said it could be that the Makar, if this is not the Makar that Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch made piyutim, meaning you're not Geris in the Medrash Rabbah or Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch like the Rashba. He says it could be the Makar was from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, where Chazal say that in Chagiga that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was mishabeach Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch by saying that he's not Doirish. And again, like we said before, Doirish could mean Kravitz, like we said from the Tais and the Rosh and the Ois before. So that is the Makar for Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch being the Baal HaPiyut. And then he brings a very interesting raya to this Shita. What's his interesting raya? Because he brings from the Shibulei Aleket that he was Mekabel from his father, from Chachmi Loisir. So in Lucir, and he says, he has like a little parenthesis over there, and he says, you know who Chachmi Lucir are? He says, Rabbeinu HaGadol, Rabbeinu Eliezer HaGadol, and Rabbeinu Shimon HaGadol, who are the Rabbeim of Rashi. We're talking about great people over here. That's he puts in his parentheses over there. And he says that they had a Kabbalah that when this Rebbe Elazar HaKalir made his piyut about the Ma'aseh Merkava, a fire came down from Shamayim and surrounded him. So he says, but you see in the Gemara, it's in the Gemara of Ein Dorshin in Chagiga, that it says when Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch was Dorish in the Ma'aseh Merkava, you're the Eish min HaShamayim. So he's saying you see a direct connection between the Python, Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, and Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. So he's saying this seemingly is a nice smach that the Rashba has a correct assumption. The Rashba is correct that the Rabbi Elazar HaKalir is Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. Then next he brings down his great Rebbe, the Heilige Noid de Yehuda, in Slach and Brachas, that he says that even if it's not Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, he says it has to be at the time when they were Mekadesh al Pi Ariyah. And he says this is clearly based on the Tosas and the Rosh that says this. This is based on the Tosas and the Rosh, and it couldn't be in the times of Abai and Rava, because in those times they already stopped from making Kiddush HaChodesh. He says, you see that from the Rambam. So he says, therefore, there is a kino that says, An in Tesha Meos. So 900 years from the Churban, that is not possible to be in the times of the Tanoim. So therefore, it sounds like it's going to be much later. So he says you have to say that they added that on later on. When the Doris got longer, someone added on 900 when they got to year 900 from the Churban. But it's not from Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, meaning however many years he said, and then later on, as the Doris went on, they added more and more until it stayed that way. That's what he says you have to say for that. However, now he goes further and he discusses the name Kalir. He says, what's this name Kalir? So he brings the aruch that says Kalir is a name of a cookie. And he says that what happened was Rabbi Elazar HaKalir ate a cookie that had a kameh on it. And from that, he became it says nispakach. He opened up. I guess that's where his poetry started flowing. I'm not really sure what he means by that, but it says that he ate some sort of, I'll read the lashon that he says. He says that he was called Kalir, Nikra, Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, she'ochal uga shehoya kosabo kameya, nispakach. Yeah. And he became opened. Yeah. However, he brings the Madane Yom Tov. Now he's back to Madane Yom Tov after he's back and forth with his name, that he says that no, his grandfather was named Kalir, and like we said before, he says you can't say like the Madane Yom Tov if you hold like Tosas and the Rosh, because if it's Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon bar Yochai, definitely it wouldn't work out. But anyways, he's saying that he was called Kalir because his grandfather was more famous than he was, so he signed his name Kalir because so people should know who he is, because apparently his father wasn't as famous as his grandfather was. That's what he says. And then he points out that he signed his name Rabbi Elazar Berebi. So he says that if he's going on himself, it means that it's like saying you're the Gadol Adar. So he's saying that Berebi was going on his grandfather, Kalir, so therefore it makes more sense. That's what he says. Okay. The next ois, in ois Zayin, he brings the opinion of the Zichron Yosef, which was Rabbi Yosef Steinhardt, and the opinion of the great Maskil Chacham Rav Wolf Heidenheim, who is very famously known for his Siddur and his Machzorim, where he, fixed up the Nischos of the Piyutim and established them. Chasam famously said on him, he was actually a student of the Atzei Arozim and the Atzei Almoigim. The Chasam Sofer famously said about him in his Teshuvah that Lulei Rav Wolf Heidenheim, the Piyutim would have been a shtakach from Klal Yisrael. He definitely was very mishabeach him. And descendants of the Chasam Sofer officially have some sort of like Kabbalah from him that they should only use his Siddur, something to that extent. But anyways, he, at the beginning, I actually have the Machzor. He, in the beginning, has a long arichas trying to figure out who Rabbi Elazar Kalir is. And as well as the Zichron Yosef as well as Rabbi Heidenheim, and they come out. He says, Lulei Divrei, Rabbi Seina Rishonim, he wants to say that he's in the times of Sadi Goyin. And again, the reason why is because of that kina of Anin Tishameis. 900 years don't work out with the Tanum and Amiroim. So therefore, it has to be like in the times of Hai Goyin or Sadi Goyin. Right, Sadi Goyin or Hai Goyin. I think the Zichron Yosef said is in time of Sadi Goyin, and Reb Wolf Heidenheim said like a little after Reb Hai Goyin. It's the same, basically the same tkufa. He says there's a big problem because in those days they didn't know where Kiryas Sefer was. So he says that Kiryas Sefer has to be referring to halachas. That's what he's saying. Not to an actual city, meaning he's saying that he was called Kiryas Sefer because of the halachas, but not that it was the actual city of Kiryas Sefer. The Teshuvah Me'ava does point out that Rav Wolf Heidenheim says the same theory as the Zichron Yosef, but he does point out that he does not ask this question of Kiryas Sefer, but he does say, very interesting, the way his lashon is, he says, but if he would have known that he was mechaven to the Zichron Yosef, he would have been very happy. However, he says, it's very, very hard to, choose their words over the words of Rabbi Seina Rishonim. And also, he says that it bothered him also to say that it was a name, that Kalir was his name, because that's what the Zichron Yosef and Rav Wolf Heidenheim are saying, that it was his actual name. Rabbi Elazar Kalir was his name, and he wasn't named for something, for a place or a cookie or anything else. He says, I looked around and all Shemus Gittin, he says in the Shemus Gittin of the Beis Shmuel, and the Shemus Gittin of Marab ben Chaviv, and the Shemus Gittin of the Chacham Chagiz. Now, for those of you who don't have a first edition of Halachas Ketanis, you have no clue what that is. For some reason, unfortunately, it was never reprinted. In the back of Halachas Ketanis, Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz, well, really the Maram Chagiz, his son, a whole bunch of Maise Bezdins and different psakim about Shemus Gittin and all different other things pertaining to Gittin in the back as a kuntris, a fill-in to the Halachas Ketanis. For some reason, it never got reprinted. So that's what he means when he says the Chacham Chagiz, and he says Yam Shloimeh. He says, I never saw this name Kalir mentioned as a name of a person. So he says, I really don't want to accept this. And then he says, there is a general taina, which would be very good according to the Zichron Yosef and according to Rav Wolf Heidenheim, which is, he says that you see from the shirim of the Torah and Tanakh and from the times of the Amiroim and the Tanoim, there was a different style shir, different style of way of song. It wasn't like the rhymes and stanzas that they had and later on. And he says possibly this didn't happen until the times of the Goinim, which would be very good according to the Zichron Yosef and according to Wolf Heidenheim. But he says in the times of the Torah, in the times of the Nach and the times of the earlier, it was a different style. And he brings from Reb Dan Yitzchak Abarbanel, he brings from Rozayim and Adoimim, he brings from Shlomo Dubna, Reb, he calls him Cham Hamafursam, Shlomo Dubna, and he brings from Moshe Dessau from his Pirush, how the structure of the Shirim of the Torah are different than the later on. However, he says, to answer for, again, the Rishonim, he says, we can say that those shirim were, so they weren't done in that style. However, shirim that were personally made, not al pi ruach hakodesh, just from their own inspiration, he says it could be they still had that style, even, or not still, but even then they had that style. That's how he answers that. And then he goes on to ask a very powerful question on the Mahalach that he's saying from the Noid Behuda and the Tosfos and the Rosh and the Rashba and the Sefer Yochsin, and that is that basically they're saying that he's a Tana, right? So they say that Moshe, the son of his Rebbe, Rameir Fishlis, right? He had actually a very good relationship with her Blade Fishlis, but this is very interesting. He quotes his brother, Moshe. He says that he brought a very good raya, very strong raya. He says, "V'chazaka mikol harayis and his koris." And the raya is that on Rosh Hashanah, the piyut of the Kalir, he says, Shloishim k'moi shloishim. We blow 30 like 30. So he says 30, that is only after we have the takana of the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Lamed Daled Aleph, according to Rabbi Vo, that said that since we don't know what is a trua, what is, if is a ganer, we don't know if it's yululi or it's ganer. So therefore, misham tzafik, we do trua, shvarim trua, tkiya, shvarim trua, tkiya, then tkiya, shvarim tkiya, and then trua, shvarim trua, and we do it 3 times each, so that equals 30. He's saying that the only way we could get 30 is only possible if we're after a bavo. So he said this is a very strong raya keneged Tosfos and all the Rishonim that we mentioned before, as well as his Rebbe the Noid Behuda. So he but he mentions the opinion of my grandfather, the Shla, and also the opinion of the Munas Chachamim, that they base it on the Arizal, that they always had, it was not established by Rabbi Vohu, but even Sinai, they had this, like, so to speak, suffix. It wasn't like a suffix, but that's the way it was supposed to be done. And the Gemara just put it out as a suffix, but really it was like that from Sinai, and he doesn't really like that. He says, he doesn't really like that. However, he brings a brilliant elucidation from our Rava, our Wolf Heidenheim, to explain this piyut. And he says that no. He says that there is a different nusach that doesn't say bezeh hachodesh or bezeh chodesh. He says bechol chodesh, in every month. And he says, Wolf Heidenheim says they're both good. And why? He says, I'll tell you why. He says, because if you look in Maseches Sukkah, Perek Hey, Mishnah Hey, the Mishnah says that during when the Beis HaMikdash was around, and when they were in Yerushalayim, or when they were in Eretz Yisrael, I'll upon him, in the Beis HaMikdash, they used to blow 30 tkiyas. And the Mishnah goes on to explain what they were. Gimel, that's 3. You could do the math now. 3, lepsichas sharim, for opening the gates. Tes, that's 9, l'tamid shel shachar. Okay? Then you have tes, the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim. So you have another 9 for the Tamid of the Bein Arbayim. And then when they had Musaf, which would be on Rosh Chodesh, or any other time, Musaf and Hoymesifin Oites. So if you have 9, 9, 9, 9 times 3 plus 3 is 30. So he says, there you get your 30, and that's why it says Bechol Chodesh. And he says, so that's why every month they would have 30 kailas. And that's what the Kali was referring to, not to the kailas of Rosh Hashanah. And he says, even if you say Bozeh HaChodesh, because on Rosh Hashanah, like the Gemara, he says he wants to bring from the Gemara and Daf Nun Hey, Amar Aleph and Sukkah, that on Rosh Hashanah as well, these truas were not Nizbatel, and they did them as well on Rosh Hashanah and Tishrei as well. So he's saying, so yes, you could say even Bazeh HaChodesh and it'll be good. Basically, he very much favors the Shita of the Rishonim. He says, listen, whatever we're saying over here, the Rishonim are saying he was a Tana. So he was definitely a Tana. Was he Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch? Was he Rabbi Elazar ben Rav Shimon? Was he a different Rabbi Elazar ben Rav Shimon? Doesn't matter. The point is, he was a Tana. He was Bizman the Tanoim. He says, even the Arizal, who was a Kadosh V'Noira, he says everyone speaks about the Arizal such greatness. He says he didn't say piyutim any other time, but on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, when it came to the kalir, he would say the piyutim, and he said that they were niskan al pi the derech ha'emes and with the right understanding. And I love this part of the Teshuvah Me'ava. This is just great, where he says, and what do I have to bring a raya from the Arizal? He says, there are people much greater than Arizal. Rashi, Tosfos, the Ramban, the Rashba, they were much greater than Arizal, and they were Mishabechim. So why do we have to bring proof from the Arizal? Not Chas v'Shalom to make light of the Arizal, but people sometimes get carried away by esotericism and all this, and they forget that, the Rishonim that we had on the page are way more holier and way more than any of these great, Mikubalim and as great as they were, the Rishonim were 1,000 times greater. And then he tries to bring a proof to Flach and the Taisis and the Rosh that Rabbi Elazar Kalir was Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, because he brings a psikta zutrasa that says V'zeh masha Amar Rabbi Elazar Kalir v'chulu. So that was in Ois Lamed Hey. He brings this. He says this is a little bit of a raya to the Tosfos and the Rosh, that Rabbi Elazar Kalir is Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, because that's the only way it would work out with the years and everything. So he says that it's not really a good raya, because he says that you could say that the Psukta Zertrosa was written by Rabbeinu Tuvia ben Rabbeinu Elazar, and he put in things in between the Psikta that he collected. But it's not all the actual Psikta, but these are the words of Reb Tuvia ben Rabbeinu Elazar. So he's saying there's no conclusive proof for that. One more thing before we sum up everything, he brings a big question that if Rabbi Elazar Kalir was from the times in the times of when they were Mekadosh al Pi, he says, so how could we have a piyut that we say on the second day of Yom Tiv for Sukkot? So he says that the Behuda says an answer, and the answer he says was that really he made a piyut for when Yom Tiv falls out on Beis Gimel or Hay. When the first day of Yom Tiv falls out on Beis Gimel or Hay, that was one piyut, because then we have the mitzvah of Daled Minim that day. So then he made the piyut of Ekcha Priya Eitz Hadar. But if the first day falls out on Shabbos, so then he made the piyut of Elam Kishanov. And then he says when they came to having a 2-day Yom Tiv, so then we just put the piyut of Shabbos first and the piyut of Priya Eitz Hadar second, because the second day there's going to be, or whenever. His taina is that when you have the second day Shabbos, why don't you switch it around? But he says, but that's the way they put it, because not always are you going to have the first day Shabbos. However, the second day doesn't fall out on Shabbos, because the first day could only fall out on Beis Gimel or Hay. So the second day is never going to fall out on Shabbos. So we established that the Pri Eitz Hadar should be on the second day. He does have a taina. I mentioned before quickly that he had a taina on the Levush. Why don't we, that if the first day fell on Shabbos, we should switch around the order on the Maratirna and the Levush, that they have the different orders. He's saying that when you have the first day Shabbos, you should switch it around. That's what he has. But the Teshuvah Me'ava has an answer, and with this he wants to answer many other. Okay, so that was his theory based on the Rabbi Yehuda, that there was one piyut they split into, or he made 2 different piyutim for different times, and then they instituted it when they had 2-day Yom Tiv. At the end, he sums up that these were great gedolim. The Rabbi Elazar Kalir was a great gadol, and we have no right to be mizalzel in his words, and he brings countless times where the Rishonim handle what he's saying and try to explain what he's saying. He brings the Tashbits, Rashi all over the Tashbits, he brings the Radak, he brings all the Rishonim that are handling and they're rechening with the words of the Kalir, and they're words that have to be taken seriously, and how chashiv they are, and how we're supposed to be enthused by reciting these prayers, which are so connected to, like he said before, so connected to the words of Chazal, and there's so much in there. There's such loaded words, and so beautifully written and laid out. And then he ends off with a very interesting thing. He ends off that I am not talking about, these are only the piyutim of the times of the Tanoim, the Amiroim, but he said in the past 150 years, new tefillas started popping up. He said, I'm not talking about those tefillas. And he says, especially, he said, the kas of Shabtai Tzvi, Yamach Shemoy, what does he call him, Sharia, and, Yaakov Frank, Yamach Shemoy, all those guys. He said, they made a lot of tefillas, and especially those guys, we stay very far away from that. But he's talking about, in the beginning, before he gets to those, to Frank and Shabtai Tzvi, he was talking about just the regular tefillas that were made. He even quotes the name of a sefer, Likutei Tzvi, and he actually says a very interesting story that his Rabbi had a lulav and esrog that was the most mehudar, and he says that the Noid Yehuda would not withhold money at all when it came to spending money on his lulav and esrog. He said, "Hakesev v'hazov lo hoya nechshev be'inov me'uma." Afsha esrog yeh betach, says the esrog should be betachlis hayoker. He says it doesn't matter. He spend all the money. And he said that there was one person who started, so basically they all used to line up and they used to want to be yotze with the lulav and esrog of the Noid Yehuda. And he said that one person started saying the Yiratzin before Netilas Lulav that is printed in Likutei Tzvi, and he said the Noid Yehuda Koas Virogaz. He got like Kaviyachol to say this on the Noid Yehuda, but he got fuming mad. Amar v'ketzav gadol, with a great storm, right? He said great anger that someone who says the Yiratzin can't be yotze with my esrog, and he basically grabbed it. He didn't let him be yotze with his lulav and esrog. So, as a summary, he was saying this great praise about Rabbi Elazar Kalir. He's trying to defend the words of Tosfos and the Rishonim, that he was a Tana, whichever Tana he was. He answers the questions, and then he goes on to praise the Kalir again and say that this is only talking about Tanoim. We're not talking about the tefillas of the Hasidim. Probably that's what he was talking about, and all the other Mekubalim that were making tefillas in the past 150 years from when he was writing this. What's interesting to note is that in Siman Tzadi of the Teshuvah Me'ava, he says about Nuschois. This is a very interesting point, so we're going to move now smoothly into another topic. He says that there's a famous, discussion about Nusach Sfarad and Nusach Ashkenaz. In Teshuvah and Siman Tzadi, he was talking about ending the bracha Hamavarach Es Amo Yisrael Bashalim with the common custom. I don't know if all Germans, but many Germans, they end in Asar Semei Teshuvah of Oyse HaShalom instead of Hamavarach Es Amo Yisrael Bashalim. So he has a long Teshuvah, very fiercely defending the minig, and then he says at the end, he sums up the Teshuvah like this. I'm going to read you his exact lashon for the flavor. He says, Ari Segel Landau, Av Bezin Reish Mem Nishmose Beganeden Elin. Shina La'atzmoi. Now listen to the words of the Teshuvah Me'ava. This is astounding. I don't know how many people know this Teshuvah Me'ava. He says like this. Shoma b'bichas hatzadikim al she'eres amcha beis Yisrael v'nosach zeh zochar Rambam. He would say Halal again. We're in Nisan. We're coming to the days of Nisan, and yes, the Noid Yehuda would say Halal on the Leil Pesach Acharat Tefillah Bibeis Hakneses. Va'anu ein noegen kain. Kasher hed haramo ba'orachaim simen tov pei zayin siv dalid v'kiyotze behem harbe me'oid. Im kol zeh, he says, and Shonim. He never said any Yiratzin or any Tefillah or any L'Shem Yuchad that they were mechadish this 150 years, like we mentioned. So he says for the tzibur, he wasn't moiche. So this sounds like some sort of like contradiction, because over here he's saying that he got very angry, and over here he's saying that, he let them do it. Unless he's going back on the Nusach HaSfardim. That's he's saying. This is how he ends off. He says B'Shailos Teshuvas Maram Ash, Chelik Shlishi, which is not the Maram Ash, it's the Panim Me'iris. That's how he ends off. And he says that he himself, he's going to change. He did it one way, and now he sees that people are getting very worked up about it, so he himself is going to change. But he says over here, very interesting, that they should switch their nusach. So the way I understood what he's saying over here, now moving on to the next topic, was that his attitude to nischois was that a person, if he feels the necessity or attachment to a certain nusach. If you look in Mishpat Siman Chav Daled, it says that the Magen Avram says that a person should not change his nusach. He's saying that's only if a person doesn't have a strong connection and feeling and passion to that nusach. He says, but if a person has a strong passion to that nusach, he says if a person feels that passion, he could do it for himself. He could change and he could go with that nusach. The way I understood what the Teshuvah Me'ava was saying was the Noid B'Yehuda felt that passion, and he says, back to the Maram Shik, the Maram Shik says that that's a raya, that is his Sherish Neshama, because the whole argument of the Magen Avram was, you don't know where your Sherish Neshama is. He says, yeah, that's when you don't have any feelings towards one nusach, but if you have a passion by yourself, not because you're part of a movement that we daven this way, but you yourself have a connection to a certain nusach, then he's saying that that's a raya, that's where your Sherish Neshama is from, and therefore you may change. So that's the way I understood what he's saying over here. But again, to change the tzibur will be forbidden. It's not more correct. He says it many times, Sfardim are not more correct than Ashkenaz are more. He said, I'm not coming to point out in the Teshuvah Chelik and Siman Aleph, he says, I'm not coming to point out any faults in any nusach. He said they're all good and all great. And again, you can't change from one to the next. However, like he's saying, the Noid B'Yehuda himself changed for himself only. It's interesting to point out, the Chassam Sofer also says a similar thing in Arachaim Siman Kuf Tzadi Zayin, I think. This is all Nachi, this is all off the cuff.
We won't hold you to it.
Yeah, so don't hold me to it. Teshuvah's Chassam Sofer says that he has a taina to a certain Rav Moshe Tamar, who was the Rav Av Bezin Kodesh of Matoivu Oyhalecha Yaakov. Do you know who that is? No. Well, I'll tell you. Tamar is title bound, and Matoivu Oyhalecha Yaakov. Well, he was the Rav of Ohel, so I guess he wanted to disguise his name because he was going to lay into him in that tshuva a little bit, very nicely, but he did. And he said that his opposition to Hasidim, now people identify Chassam Sofer as Hasidish, he was not Hasidish. He was German.
The Yeki.
And yes, and he was very proud about it. And he has a whole tshuva about how you can't switch from Ashkenaz to Sfarad. And he says that his Rebbe Rav Nosson Adler and Haflo did daven Sfarad, or Sfardi, whatever it was because he said, because that's how the Arizal made his kavanas. And he said if the Arizal would have been Ashkenaz, then he would have made the tikkunim in Ashkenaz. Now, many people attack the Chassam Sofer, including the Divrei Chaim Tzanzarov. He attacks the Chassam Sofer and he says, what do you mean? The Arizal was Ashkenaz. And the answer is very obvious, because if you look at the history of Yerushalayim, where the Arizal was born in Yerushalayim, and his father was in Yerushalayim. Yes, he left to Egypt afterwards. Mitzrayim, he left afterwards. But he grew up originally in Yerushalayim. The way it was, the structure was, Ashkenaz, the Ashkenaz minyan did not convene only on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. They scraped together a minyan during the year. So then his father davened with the Sfaradim the whole year. Only on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where they were able to scrape together a minyan, then they daven Ashkenaz. And very interesting coincidence, the Arizal, everyone agrees, davened Ashkenaz on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Surprisingly so. So the answer is very simple. The Arizal was following the custom of his father, that he davened Sephardi the whole year because that's when they had a minyan. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they did not. So that's what the Chassam Sofer means, that he was Sephardi. Doesn't mean that he was from Sephardic descent. What it means is that he davened the nusach of the Sfaradim. Like we said, that was his custom because they couldn't get together a minyan other than Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. In any event, he says that to change, that's not what they were doing. He says if there would be a person like the Arizal, he would make kavanas for Ashkenaz also. It's not one better over the other. However, he said they changed because they wanted to daven with kavanas, and therefore they switched. But he says to make a movement, he says, of Hasidus, that is wrong. He says, why? He says, because Shuras Hadin, everyone is obligated in, and everyone's obligated equally in. However, Lifnim Shuras Hadin, everyone has to work with his own self. And these, I'm putting it into my own words, like Chazal say, Kshem Shem Partufam Shavin, Kach Ein Deyasem Shavin. No one is equal. Everyone has their unique way of serving Hashem, and therefore you cannot make a movement of Hasidus because everyone has to look into themselves and reach into themselves and go up the way his personality is. So there can't be a movement of Hasidus. This is his attack on Hasidim. But anyways, getting back to what we're talking about over here, that's possibly what the Teshuvah Me'ava is saying over here from the Noda B'Yehuda. The Noda B'Yehuda was reaching into himself and changing the nuschos based on his, his feeling and his godless and the way he's supposed to grow. But again, he's not changing the tzibur because everyone has to have the unique path in Avodas Hashem. Okay, so
I think, we covered a lot of ground already just in that first Teshuvah and then the additional one you tacked on in Tzadi. Yeah. I think you see right there that really illustrates the breadth of the Teshuvah Me'ava, Elazar Fleckles' knowledge. I mean, it's not your typical Teshuvah at all. I think in some ways, the Piyat Teshuvah Aleph, might be the most famous Teshuvah in Teshuvah Me'ava just because it's right off the bat, it's interesting, it's historic. I mean,
Siddur Vilna liked it very much. They printed the whole thing from beginning to end in their Keser Malchus in the beginning of their Machzor Vilna.
I think Bichlal, this whole topic is something. The Kalir is always a question. Who was the Kalir? When did he live? This Tosfos is well known. Rabbi Yaakov Emden argues on Tosfos. He says he's not a Tana. I think the scholarly consensus, and don't quote me on this either, I think it's like 5th, 6th century is when the Kalir was. But obviously there's all different opinions. This is a very famous tshuva, quite lengthy, quite interesting tshuva of Rabbi Elazar Fleckles and tshuva.
My Rabbi, or Shlomo Brevda, always used to say, you don't have, your birth certificate doesn't allow you to say such a thing. Meaning we have no way to know for sure, like you're saying.
So many different opinions on so many different sides and so many different. We don't know.
Anyone who would say, let's say, about the Harabai is a certain opinion or anything about that, he would say, could I see your birth certificate? Do you have the ability to say such a thing with such clarity? I wanted to point out. Okay.
Yeah, let's move on to some. So there's a couple other ones. I mean, obviously, there's so many that we could discuss. For the listener not familiar with Teshuvah Me'ava, just taking, those two as examples, and we mentioned some other ones. But there's a couple more I think are worth highlighting. And we'll see how many we get to. Obviously, it's going to be a long episode, but we'll see how many we get to. There's the one about the Zayar to Carl Fisher, which I think is a fascinating and very important tshuva. There's the tshuva about vaccines, the tshuva about shaving chalamoid. It's a whole bunch of other ones. Kidneys, I think. There's a whole bunch of other interesting ones. But I'll turn it to you which one you want to turn to next. And just maybe we won't go as in depth as the one we just discussed there about Piyutim, but you can, take it away. Tell us a little bit more about Teshuvah Me'ava.
Okay, so if you want to discuss the controversy about the Zayar, so he actually has a tshuva on the Zayar, which interesting is most of the tshuva is dedicated to actually Shvuah, and at the very end he talks about a Zayar.
And I should jump in. I'm going to jump in for a minute here. Yeah. Farm Chatter did a 5-part series on the reception history of the Zayar. Did quote Rabbi Elazar Fleckles in his very strong words that he has about the Zayar and Rashbi. Not against Rashbi, but about the Zayar being written by Rishon Bechai, rather. Also, we've talked about on a bunch of auction chatters, Moshe Maimon and myself have talked about this Shvuah, and then where they would swear on, and the Chumash, the special Chumash that they had there. Actually, Machon Netzach Yaakov owns a copy of that Chumash. There's a couple of those, I think. Machon Netzach Yaakov owns a copy of that Chumash, Rabbi Elazar Fleckles. And so that's something we also mentioned on the first episode, but I'll try to make
that was actually directly connected to this tshuva, that Chumash. And the reason why was because Carl Fisher was saying that, yes, they swear on a Chumash, but I heard that they said that they'll swear falsely to a guy, they'll swear falsely to on a Chumash, but a Zoyar, ooh, that's scary. So because of that, I think the Teshuvah Me'ava saw a potential Chil Hashem that's coming out, that people were mechabed more the Zoyar, or scared of more the Zoyar than a Sefer Chumash or a Sefer Tanakh. That was like a big zilzal in Kavod Hashem, and therefore I think he felt very strongly to, stand up for the honor of the Chumash and Hashem and speak very strongly about the authenticity of the Zohar. He does, really, so like I'm saying, he's talking about in the beginning about Shvuah to Goyim, how they are Nemon, how you have to swear honestly. And he brings an interesting proof. How do we know that to what extent the Jewish people would go to swear correctly even to a Goy? He says, we're talking about Goyim, that there was a halacha in the Torah of Lois Chaya Kol Neshama. And yet, when Rochav made them make a Shvuah, they had to listen. And he says, look at this. He has 5 points on how a Shvuah was so important by Yidden that we would not do these 5 things. He says, 1, by the way, he has numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not Aleph Beis. This is just a side thing. It's interesting. Again, he's writing to Carl Fisher. Anyways, he says, that's what we see from this. Another thing we see is afilu umas harishoim ha'isim kol ha'ta'evos, that Hashem says we should kill them all out. But again, we're making a shvuah to them, We have to be sticking to our words. And then he says, third thing, even if you're going to be mevatel a mitzvah of loisachai kol neshama as well. Yes, the Shavua overrides that. And then a fourth taina, he says, also, if you have a taina that, I'm a oinus, right? Because their life was at stake if they didn't make the Shavua. Still, you have to uphold your Shavua. You have to keep to your word. And the fifth one was the chiyuv on Chiyav al kol echad mi Yisrael l'shtadel kol koichoi shaloi lavar chaveri ish ubrisa el shvua shava sheker. He's saying that a person has to be very careful not to be over on his treaties. And he says, and if you want to say that Rochav's not a raya because they had akar satoiv, he says, okay, so what about the Gevainim, right? So he says, you see clearly that you have to keep your word, even if it's to Goyim. Then he goes and he says that guy said, Ha'ish hahu, that the Sefer HaZohar is kulei kadosh. Ani, he says again, he's talking about Shavuos. He says, Ani oimer hareini nishpa b'toras Hashem. Shebe Sefer HaZohar nimsu kama ziyufim v'kilkulim asher isifu. Right?
I read this language exactly on that series. It's a very strong language. Keep going, keep reading.
And he says that they added. Now, what's funny is, what he goes on to do is he goes to cast doubt on the whole Zohar entirely. So what's funny is he's saying that they added, and then he goes on to attack the entire existence of the Zohar. He's saying one of his main arguments is that Rabbi was a Talmud of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, so how come he didn't mention it? And he says, how come the Rambam, Rashi, Tosfos, Rabbi Nachmani, in the Medrash Rabbah, again he's with the Rabbi Nachmani, Rabbi Yochanan, Talmud Yerushalmi, no one quoted the Sefer HaZohar. We see Seder Olam's quoted. We see other Tanoic literature is quoted in the Gemara, in the Rishonim, in the Midrashim, and as well as in the Yerushalmi. But he says the Zohar is never quoted. That is one question. Again, this casts doubt on the entire Zohar, not just that they added. It's casting doubt on the entire Zohar. And then he points out, listen, I'm not coming to cast doubt on Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, chas v'shalom. That's what he says. I'm just coming to say that this thing that they're calling Sefer HaZohar, he says it didn't exist until like 300 years ago. Then all of a sudden people popped out. Oh, here's a Sefer HaZohar. That's what he says. And he's saying that basically Reb Shimon, but Lav Gushpanke Reb Shimon Bar Yochai Aziktei Chosam Alei. It's not his stamp. It's not him. And he's very strong with the Yavitz that says that it's not him.
And Matmachas, and this is in line with his Rebbe, the Rabbi Yehuda, who has a drasha in Shal Shuvah Rabbi Yehuda that most of it was put back now. In the new one, it was originally censored. There's still a little piece missing where he says such a language, and he also quotes Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Some Sefer quotes to Rabbi Yaakov Emden in Teshuvah, and this is very well, this. And by the way, I think Elazar Sheni, there's a very strong drasha where he talks about them. We'll get to this in the next episode. I won't give it away. We'll get there, but keep going.
Yeah. Anyways, and then he brings a very, very very sly, I don't want to call it sly, but very suave, let's call proof that it's not the Zohar. He says a very interesting thing. He says that many people use the Zohar as a springboard for many evil things. He says, Toi Tzvi, that's Shabtai Tzvi, and Tmereu, Yaakov Frank, Shem Risham Yerko. If the Zohar was really written by Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, how could such kilkulim come out from the words of it? Again, everything he says over here, there is what to answer. And there were many achronim, the Magen Metzina, and our favorite Moshe Kunitz, who went out to defend how the Zohar is written.
Inside joke on the podcast. Sorry, he wrote the Sefer Ben Yochai, and this is, listen, again, I point everyone to that series. Obviously, the defense.
By the way, you know what the Chassam Sofer said about Kunitz. He said, Rabbi Pitzim Oines Menashikas Soina. He says, even though he defended the Zohar, but he said he'd rather learn the Yavitz than learn what Kunitz had to say.
There's a quote, so there's a quote like that. But in general, when it comes to that, as I said, listen, as you said, we're just discussing here what Elazar Fleckles says. Also, to point out, as I said it on the Zohar series, and I'll say it here again, the defense of the Zohar is that, it's almost similar to what Elazar Fleckles just said, which is that the Zohar had Meridik Siyata Deshmaya, and it was Neskabel and Gans Klal Yisrael, and all the Poskim, and it made its way into Halacha, and it was accepted by the Gedolim, by the Ari, and the Gra, etc., etc. So therefore, we accept it as Rashbi. That's the defense of the Zohar, and that's it. we're just pointing out, but Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, this is what he says in Teshuvah Me'ava and in some other places as well. Yeah.
Now, I wanted to point out, this is the second part of where I'm getting to, about the Zohar, that he does discuss the Zohar in 3 more places in the Teshuvah Me'ava. As far as I know, could be someone out there knows more, but I know 3 more places where he discusses it.
I'll also point out that we're recording this before the new Machonas Yaakov Teshuvah Me'ava. We don't have it in front of us before we have it in front of us. So therefore, I'm sure they're quoting and putting other places. Maybe we'll see other places as well when that comes out and we get the beautiful new edition. Continue.
One place is in Siman Yud Gimel, where he's talking to I think he's talking to a bacher, right? And over there, he, lays into him for getting involved with the Zohar, and he says, like, what are you doing with the Zohar? He says you should be, one more thing he says in Siman Chavav over there of the Zohar, he says, and this is going to be pertaining to what we're saying right now, he says, that's what he says. So again, when he's talking to this bacher, he's saying, like, what are you doing with the Sefer HaZohar, and what are you getting involved in Reb Shimon Bar Yochai's words? This is not for you to read. He says, this is one of the, he brings about davening, that you have to hear your voice. He says, this is one of the rayas. Why? Because the Haba Talmud Parshas Yaakov b'Shem Rashbi mashma shafilu hashmila oznav aser. So he says from the Gemara, and it sounds like we're saying from Ravina Ravashi saying that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai were misakin, that you shouldn't say it loud, right? But you should be but he's saying from the Zohar it's mashma that he shouldn't be mashmila oznav even, and therefore he's saying this is a ksas raya, not like the Zohar. However, I want to point out that in Siman Aleph, I skipped this over because I wanted to get back to it. He says like this. He says that Reb Wolf Heidenheim has so many questions on the Divrei Rishonim, the Rashba, Tosfos, the Rosh, and all the Rishonim that we mentioned. He says all his kashas, asher tonu keneg. He says yesh li yashvam. Ki hein gufa atainis asher tonu keneged sefer hazoyer v'kayotze b'zeh kamas sifrei kadmoinim midrashes asher chibru tanoim v'amaroim. So you see that he himself said that there's what to answer, and he's basically, it looks like what he's saying is that there is what to answer, but this is the attitude that he's choosing for this bacher who is obviously learning, Zohar instead of dedicating his time then for Gemara. And again, calls Fisher, which was being fed this craziness that the Sefer HaZohar is more holy than a Chumash. And as well, he brings this down. He has a kuntris on Kaddish in Chelik Beis. He has like a little kuntris on Kaddish. So over there in this kuntris on Kaddish, which is going on the Siman Shulchan Aruch of Kuf Lamed Beis, it's in Siman Reish Chav Tes, right? He made like a kuntris, and Ois Yud, he talks about the famous controversy of a lady saying Kaddish for someone, right? So in more recent times, we have a Teshuvah from Moshe about it. We have a Teshuvah from Henkin about it. 3 Teshuvahs from Henkin about it. So he was talking about in the Chavas Yori, he talks about it, but he says that I do not agree to girls coming into the Beis Medrash at all. Any girl coming in, even small girls coming into the shul at all. What does he bring as a proof? He brings Kosav Bezoyer v'chol chachmei ha'emes. So his proof that you should not bring girls into the Beis HaKnesses is from the Heilige Zohar and the Chachmei ha'emes. So again, you see like this back and forth with the Teshuvah Me'ava. Again, we're presenting a theory, at least I am presenting a theory, that maybe it was because of who he was talking to, how he cast doubts, because like we're seeing in Siman Aleph, he's saying, you can answer these questions just like you could answer these questions on the Zohar.
Also, there's something that we'll discuss in the next episode, the 3rd episode, which when we get to Avos David and the Franks, he's fighting against the Franks. Prague was a hotbed of Frankish activity. We mentioned this in episode 1 of this series. And so you have this with the Bnei Yehuda as well. We know that Bnei Yehuda has comments against the Zohar as well, as mentioned. But yet the Bnei Yehuda learned in the Klois and Brody, which was a real Kabbalistic center. And we know the Bnei Yehuda knew Kabbalah. And this has to do with the whole Shem Yichud thing with the Bnei Yehuda. Again, we'll put all that aside. It's a very interesting point. It's very interesting to see this Teshuvah, and very interesting to see, the various comments in the Teshuvah Me'ava. I think now we should move on to other comments, as mentioned, there are a number of other fascinating tshuvas in the Teshuvah Me'ava, and that some well known, some less well known. So, Moshe, I'll give you the floor to talk about which ones you want to highlight and you want to point out for the listener to again illustrate more.
Yeah. So the next thing I would want to talk about probably is the famous controversy of Sheitlach.
An old controversy. There's a controversy now about Sheitels. Comments about Sheitels.
I'm not so sure. It could be everyone finally came normal and everyone wears Sheitels these days. Anyways, so, there are those poskim in Eretz Yisrael that are very strongly worded against people who don't wear Sheitels. It's important to point out that Moshe said famously in a Teshuvah that I don't understand how you could force your wife to not wear a sheitel and wear a tichel. He says, Mi'ikar adin, it's completely mutter. And we see a similar attitude, the Teshuvah Me'ava. What's interesting is his counterpart, the Bigdei Kahuna, who they were very mechabed. And actually, in Bigdei Kahuna, just to understand who the Bigdei Kahuna was, one of the shoyalim, one of the ones who asked the Bigdei Kahuna questions was none other than Rabbi Kiva Eger, the Rav of Friedland at that point, and then later became the Rav of Posen, the famous, the Heilige Rabbi Kiva Eger that everyone knows and studies his words in the Beis HaMedrash. Great Rabbi Kiva Eger, he was one of the shoyalim by the Bigdei Kahuna, as well as the Teshuvah Me'ava together with the Betzalel Ranchberg. They asked him a question, and he writes them back a Teshuvah in the Bigdei Kahuna. So it's interesting, in his Sefer Nachlas Avis, which I've seen myself, I actually have one. Yeah, he says...
You have a lot of rare books.
Yeah, he says on Daf Yates over there, very sharp words against those who wear Sheitlach. The Teshuvah Me'ava makes no regard to his words, even though he does quote them and he does respect them very much. And on the other hand, he strongly words a defense against those who attack the Shiltei Giborim. And he says, no, it is aleinu to defend them and to defend the woman of old that wore Sheitlach. And this is my message that I'm taking from the Teshuvah Me'ava against there are certain poskim in Eretz Yisrael who very sharply attack those who wear Sheitlach and don't wear a tichel, that they're keneged halacha, and all the poskim don't hold this way. Well, the Teshuvah Me'ava has words for you. And I must say, he says like this, V'chein nochein hadover la'asos. Lechaper v'lilmid zchus al noshin ksheris ubefrat b'doros harishonim asher mosru nafshayu al kedushas Hashem ilu hoyu b'chlal overas al dos Yehudis v'gedoylei hador umilim v'shoitim. What the Teshuvah Me'ava is saying here, that the proper thing to do is to be mechaper and to be melamid zchus on all those that were all those ladies that were mosru nafshayu kedushas Hashem, and the proper thing is not to fight them and not to say that they were doing wrong. The proper thing is to defend them. He's saying these ladies were moiser nefesh al kedushas Hashem, and he said for sure the gedolim in those times, if they would have been over adas, for sure they would have told them lo yecharishu tzarim lo otzu milim b'shoitim with sticks, even if they had to. But these ladies were much. So the proper thing is not to attack them, adarabah, to be melamed zchus. And therefore, even at the end of the Teshuvah, where he's mechalik between the two different types of sheitels, and therefore those machmirim want to say that, he doesn't mean the sheitels of today, whatever they want to do. But they have to remember the words in the beginning of the Teshuvah. In the beginning of the Teshuvah, where he's saying that the proper thing is not to fight them, it is to be melamed zchus on the noshim tzidkonius, the noshim ksheris. The next thing I wanted to talk about was an interesting thing, which actually we saw one Teshuvah they let us in on, which actually has a connection to this topic that we have over here. The topic was with Dina de Malchusa Dina getting involved in Kedushin. He says that where he's saying that the Kedushin wouldn't be valid according to the Medina, but it will be valid according to Halacha, does that affect the Halacha because of Dina de Malchusa Dina? And of course he says that, yes, he does a tremendous aver of doing something against the law. Again, this is the Teshuvah Me'ava's Mahalach, was to be very, good with the Medina and always abiding the laws and always doing what's proper, which, that was his whole, we see from the Ksos Einayim. And he says that, yes, he did a tremendously bad thing, but he says the Kedushin is Taifis. There's no way that Dina Malchusa could get involved in the in the Kedushin, and he says an interesting svara. I'm assuming this is just because, this is his whole attitude to be on good terms with the government. He says, because really the king, if he would know the halacha, he would want us to keep our halachas. Because the kings now, he said, I'll read the lashon that he says, not the kings of before. Those kings were bad, they're evil. But he says, but now, he says that all the kings would like that everyone follows their religion. But he's saying they don't know. So therefore, so it went against their rutzin. But their real rutzin is that everyone should do their religion. So therefore, it's going to be kaim the kedushin, and he has to get a get, but he did something wrong by going against the Medina. The next tshuva that we wanted to discuss is another tshuva, a very interesting tshuva, Siman Kuf Lamed Daled and Kuf Lamed Hey, and as well a follow-up in Reish Ayin Hey in Chelik Beis, where he talks about the smallpox shot vaccine. If the doctor was coming to the town only on Shabbos, and he's saying the only way they could get the shot is on Shabbos, what should they do? There's problems, Messiah, Chabura, all these problems. The Teshuvah Me'ava addresses all the issues, and he actually at the end he talks about how there are different types of needles. One makes more of a wound, more blood comes out, and one almost no blood comes out. And he says that it's a psik ratio. If blood comes out, it's a psik ratio delay nichale, because he said that he was told by the doctors that the more blood comes out, the less effective the shot is. And I think today they're agreeing to this idea. So therefore he's saying it's a psik ratio delay nichale, and he talks about the whole machlokes shach and taz about makif and nikif and siyua, and he comes out that you may do it. He says the best way to do it is with a certain needle, which makes lesser of chabura, and he says he outlines how to do it. But another interesting point that comes out in that tshuva is that he makes a massive chiddush, which comes under attack in Chelik Beis from a Baruch Yetlis, the Tam HaMelech, on Shar HaMelech, the Tam HaMelech on Shar HaMelech, in which he says that Zman Mu'it, he says, I'll read to you the Lashon, Nirlan is daiti dover chodesh liyoim. He holds that one day is considered as Zman Mu'it and loy chashin lemisa, but 2 days is not considered Zman Mu'it, and therefore we are chashin lemisa. And in the second volume in Siman Reish Ayin Hey, Rabbi Baruch Yetlis attacks the Teshuvah Me'ava on this, trying to bring proofs from the Sukkah, from Hilchas Sukkah, about using animals for the walls and all this, about Chashin and Lamisa by Zman Mu'it and Zman Meruba. Since the Teshuvah Me'ava is saying that after 2 days you are Chashin and Lamisa, so he tried to attack him on this. The Teshuvah Me'ava answers him back very strongly. He says, you should have asked a better question. He says a very interesting thing. He said, if I didn't realize that the letter came from Shemikorecha Baruch, I wouldn't have believed that you said such a question. He said, I have a better question for you. He asks a different question. He goes on to answer that as well. And therefore he comes out with a very interesting chiddush that Zman Mu'it is only 1 day and Zman Meruba is 2 days. And that means that we're Chayshish Lamisa after 2 days. Another thing that he addresses in Chelik Beis, if I remember correctly, there's another famous tshuva from the Teshuvah Me'ava that he talks about. He talks about Kitnius. At that time, there was a certain Talmud Chacham, we're not going to mention his name, that had a yeshivas bezdin under the reform. He was actually, I will say his name is the Maralab, and he wanted with a bezdin under the reform. Well, they weren't posing as reform, but they were trying to help Judaism, and they made a yeshivas bezdin. They wanted to be mater kitnius, and the Teshuvah Me'ava does say that he does recognize the Maralab as a chashuv yid, and he says probably the other ones are chashuv as well. I don't know what they were. I don't know if they were, but he says, listen, if they're sitting with the Maralab, they must be something. But he does go very strongly how you cannot be mavatal kitnius, isser of kitnius at all, and this is a minig, and we can't. There's a minig of Klal Yisrael for many days, and he goes very strongly to defend the minig. And in Siman Reish Nun Tes, and this is in Chelik Beis, in Ois Ches, he highlights, he pulls the words of the Maharil and Kitnius that he said from his Rebbe, the Maharash, from Shalom Ostreich, the Gazrinon Shaloi, Lebashlam Pesach Kitnius, Afal Pi Shaloi Machmitzin, Kim Chamishas Min Chitim Mikomakam Gozru, Kol Mini Kitnius, Atu, Heima Isa. So he says over here that he brings in the Maharil that anyone who is mekel in the Isser of Kitnius is being nichshal in Kol Oivra Devrei Chachamim, that's Chayiv Misa, and he's over on the lav loy saser Mikol Adovar Shayirucha. Very strongly worded, and that's the Teshuvah in Reish Lamed Tes. He goes on further until Ois Chai, and in Ois Chai, which is Yudches, he brings that his very good friend Manovu Dibris Ididi Harava Goin Mifilda as filth. Besifrei Big Dekuna Bechelek Arachaim Siman Yud She'en Koich Lavatel Minig Shenogu Aviseim Va'avois Aviseim Mikol Medinas Ashkenaz the Leadifi the Medag Deluge Amishmamino Minig Aviseim Be'edeim. He said, we see that Rav, who was the Rabban Shal Kol Bnei Agoylo, when he came to Bavel, he saw that they were reading Hallel and they were skipping around. Right? He saw they were reading Hallel, and he wanted to stop them. And once he saw they were skipping around, he said, it must be, it's their minig, and therefore he didn't stop them. So what the Big Dekuna is saying is that these Chacham, the Maralab, Ubeis Dinoi, are not any better than Rav. And just like Rav couldn't stop them because their minig was to say Hallel and Rosh Chodesh, so too the Maralab cannot stop us from our minig of Kitnius. This is what the Big Dekuna says. What's interesting is this volume that I'm holding, that I own actually over here, was actually, I have the actual Ksav Yad Koche of the Teshuvah Me'ava, and it's presented to the Big Dekuna. I'll read over here. Be'ezus Hashem Yisbarach, he writes over here, Mincha de Kafon, and is an Anivus. He writes like it's a Kafon is Mloshen Anias, like my poor gift, li Didi Harav Hagoyin Hagodol Mefursan L'Shvach, Keshes Moihazach, which stands for Moreno Harav Zalman Koyen, because his name was Meshulam Zalman. Ezin Reish Mem Mekilas Kodesh Fiyoda Me'esa Mechaber. And this is Moshe, that this is the Ksav Yad on the Mechaber. And we see that throughout this Chelik Beis, he actually quotes him. So it's very cute that he presented him the sefer that he quotes him in. Okay, now the next topic I wanted to speak about was the topic of shaving on Chol HaMoed. The Teshuvah, the Yehuda has a very controversial Teshuvah where all the Gedolim Kamat were Oimid Kenegdoi, and how he patiently answered them and all their tainus. Ad K'dei Kach, if you look at the way the Binyan Ariel, his Teshuvah to the Noid Behuda, meaning you could look between the lines of the Teshuvah Me'ava and you see his sharply worded words to the Noid Behuda and how the Noid Behuda answers him. It's interesting to note that in the Binyan Ariel, the Teshuvah is much more toned down. So apparently he was influenced by the Noid Behuda's Teshuvahs, meaning that he realized that, there is what to answer, that the Noid Behuda has what to answer, but yet he still held his opinion. He still held his ground. He actually starts off that Teshuvah, and I know the one who is matir. He doesn't say who it is. He says, I know the one who is matir. He's mikrvenu. He's one of us. He's misharenu. He's actually a relative of the Noid Behuda, and the Binyan Ariel were relatives. He actually says in the Teshuvah to the Noid Behuda, he says, no one's going to listen to you anyway, so you might as well be chayzer. So he said, listen, I'm coming to tell you the halacha. If you want to listen to me, good. Right? He said, I need people to listen to me. That's Noid Behuda answered him back. And again, in the Binyan Ariel, he was much more toned down. So now, in the Teshuvah Me'ava, in his Hagois to Siman Tov Kuf Lamed Aleph, in Sif Beis, he says, Ein Migalchem B'moed, Afilu Golach Koyd B'moed, cannot be Migalech, he can't shave on Chol HaMoed, even if he did it before Yom Tiv. He shaved before Yom Tiv. He cannot shave on Yom Tiv, or trim or whatever, cut his hair. So he brings over there the Teshuvah's Noid Behuda. Himtzi Gelech, he says, he's talking about the Rishonim, he's talking about the Tam. The Rishonim helping. The spoke about Messiah, touched on Messiah about shots on Shabbos. So he's saying by Shari Yisurim, there's no problem of Messiah. In Mashakos of the Shaila's Teshuvah's Teshuvah Me'ava, Chelik Aleph Siman Kuf Lamed Hey, which was talking about shots. That's about the Makavinikif, the Shach Nataz, about Messiah Boy Mamish, how to reconcile those Gemaras. Now he brings like this Sif Katan Yud Gimel, where he answers back many of the ones who argue on him. And he says the Shoel asked a few questions, but he didn't get the whole idea. You're going to tell me that there's a problem of shaving on Chol HaMoed because of Maris Ayin. So he said, weren't Chazal mater because on Chol HaMoed alidei poil ani? So any malacha that was muta alidei poil ani, you should ask that, hey, it should be Maris Ayin. He's saying maybe you could say that that the difference is because over here his hair is going to be cut, so it's a marisayin for everyone. Only when by the shar malachas, only b'shas the malacha, there's going to be a problem of marisayin. Masha'enkin later on, there's not going to be a problem, so maybe we're not chosh over there. And then he says, Nela me'ein habadoylach divrei amogen avram soif simin tavkuf lamadalad she'oiser lasis malacha b'farhesi al yedei poil oni she'ein lema yoichal v'tomahati al kol hama'arim al psag Ze beheter giluach shemavorim b'sefer binyan Ariel b'soifui v'shelas Teshuvah Neidah Yehuda Madura Tanyolos shelo yaviu divrei Magen Avram elu l'stira. He says that it's a wonder that no one brought this Magen Avram that says clearly, not like the Neidah Yehuda, as a stira to the words of the Neidah Yehuda, that he says alidei poel ani, it's also to do malacha b'farasya. He says Yan chasni zikni Bala El Yerabba, V'simin Tovkov Men Beis, Sifkon Beis, Megamgem B'divrei Magen Avram, V'ayin Masha Kasab, that because the El Yerabba was mefakfik on the Divrei Magen Avram, so therefore he says that you could be, like he says at the end of the next one on Sifches, he says Al Ma'alidei Poel Ani Im Gilach Erva Regel Kipsak Mori V'Rabbi Agoyin Nishmasa Eden. He says, Efsher sheish l'lahakel b'li pikbuk. That's what he says very strongly, that you're allowed to be seimech on the Teshuvah Neidah Yehuda if he ready shaved before, and it's alidei poel ani she'ein lo ma yoichal. The Magen Avram, he's saying the El Yerabba has what to answer for that, and he deals with that. Now, what's interesting is, in Chelek Gimel, in Hilchas Kavod Rabbi, Simin Reish Mem Beis, right? That's Hilchas Kavod Rabbi. In the Shach Sif Katan Yud Zayin, the Gillian over there, he says about Chachamim doing mattering things that were noig by heter, right? She'oser Chacham lahater dover, that's rogel to be oser, then everyone's going to be matmi on him. He says Avalim Oimer L'shoil tam bedover, if he tells the shoil a good reason why he's being matter, this surprising heter, he says then that's different, if it's understandable and they could accept the tam. So he says like this, Hitir Rebbe Beishan Kula. So he brings that Gemara of Chulin where Rebbe was matter Beishan, and then he says like this, V'niralan yazdaiti. This is the Teshuvah Me'ava talking. That the Shach is saying that if he gives the tam for his word that is permitted, most of the Gdolei Hadar in the cities and most of the cities of Klal Yisrael where there's Kehilas of Klal Yisrael, they're masking to what he says. This only gives room for people to make breaches in Yiddishkeit, and it's only going to make problems. And where we just read from, that's in Chelik Beis, and now he says that's the Chidah. V'nimtza shekasav kayotze boy, the kayotze b'dvarim that he just said, b'simin zayin le'inin guluach b'chayil moed, and the yesod that he's saying is that not that the Neidah Yehuda chas v'shalom is wrong me'ikar adin, and it's not a simin min hashamayim that it's wrong. But the point is, if roiv of the places and roiv of the rabbonim are noig by iser, then it's going to make a problem with people in Yiddishkeit in other areas, because it's going to make a pirza that people are going to follow one Rav against something that's accepted to be usher. That is the problem with doing such a thing. And therefore, he says, V'hadranid bi mashe kosav v'sefer Teshuvah Me'ava shom v'shulchan aruch tavkuf lamed aleph sifches ala gilyon, where he talks about shaving on Chol HaMoed, and he says it could be mekel b'lisham pikpuk on Shitas Rabbi. He's saying, but since Lamaisa it was not neskabel, he says that he's hodder from the psak. What's interesting is that Moshe Feinstein Zatzal in his Sefer did seem to go along the lines of the Noid, not exactly, but along the lines of the Noid, and he did seem to accept what the Noid says. My uncle, Zol sein gesund und stark, is a Rav in Mexico, probably one of the biggest Rabbonim in Mexico at the current time, and I have spoken to him in halacha a few times. I don't see him that much, but I've spoken to him his name is Avram Tobal. He's the Rav of Monte Sinai in Mexico, and he has told me that he tells his B'nai Kehila in Mexico that for them it's a mitzvah to shave on Chol HaMoed. And he said the reason why is because you shave every day. And now it's going to come to Chol HaMoed, you're not going to shave? He said you shave every day. And you have the Noid Behuda, you have Moshe Feinstein, you have what to rely on. So he tells us B'nai Kehila that Adarabba, it's covered Yom Tiv, and it's a mitzvah to shave l'chvoi the Chag. That's what I was makabel from him.
This is a big topic. The historian Meir Ben-Yo has an entire book, Taglachas B'Choyle Shel Moed, and in fact this controversy was reignited by the Haskalah, by Yitzchak Shmuel Reggio, Yosher of Gorizia, who wrote a book on this, and his father wrote a book. His father was a big makubal, was a Rav Avram Reggio, wrote a book anonymously against him. It's Maimer HaTaglachas and Taglachas HaMaimer, was his father's sefer. This is actually fun for those that are familiar with this. So this was actually something that was reignited. There was a lot of hack in Italy. This is basically a contemporary of Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, a little younger in that tkufa in the 19th century. So that's that topic. Again, these are just a flavor. We're running long here, quite a long episode, but there's a lot. There's so much in Teshuvah Me'ava, so many just fascinating.
Another thing he brings over here in the Teshuvah Me'ava, very, very interesting point. He brings over here that a Rav that should be makel by mistake, if he comes out of a sugya and he's makel by mistake on a isser, let's say he paskined on a lung that it is kosher, and really it was treif, and he made a mistake. He said that mistake is a mistake between bein adam lamakim. He says, however, if the Rav did the opposite, if the lung was taka kosher and he made a mistake and he tarfed it, he said, well, that's a mistake bein adam l'chaveroi, and that aim yom ha'kippurim yichaprim ad shiratzes chaveroi. So therefore, he's saying a Rav has to be very careful when he paskins these shilas to not make mistakes on the Chumer side and say, oh, well, I'll just be machmir. He's saying that could come to much worse problems for himself, I'm saying, than if he tries to learn the sugya correctly. We're talking about a competent Rav, and he makes a mistake the other way. Another interesting thing that the Teshuvah Me'ava says, this is in Chela Gimel, the Teshuvah Me'ava says, very interesting thing. He says that he was mekabel from the Noid Behuda, that in most of the times, I'm going to read you the Lashon. Most of the times the mechaber is mekel, and the Ramah is from the machmirim. However, when it comes to the topic of removing a sircha with miach and mishmush, that's like mushing it and playing with it, right? It's the switch. It's around. It's turned around. The mechaber is machmir and the Ramah is mekel. And he says like this, and it would have been better that it would have been the opposite way around, that everyone would have been machmir by miach and mishmush. That many michsholim came out from this kul of miach and mishmush, and all the achronim in those times, the Chassam Sofer and the Chulu, they all speak about how then they started doing kiluf. And they were basing it on this heter of the Ramah. And I think that's what he was referring to, that there's a big problem coming out of this heter of Miach Mishmush, because then they were being mekel b'kiluf. Some Sofer, and if I remember correctly, ends up coming out that it's better, and they all rely on it these days, right? So Masha Einon B'chol HaKehila Shezachar Mechaber, they don't have these takolas because the Mechaber is Machmir. Omnam Kein Kibalnu Oleinu V'al Zareinu V'ad Oilam B'Medinas Ashkenaz Upoilin Hanim Shochim Achar Haramo Moshe Emes V'Sayrosay Emes Uminei Loy Sazua. That's what he says from the Noid Behuda. He's saying that, yes, I agree that we should have been more machmir in this area. However, he says, we, Bnei Ashkenaz in Poland, Moshe Emes v'Sarosa Emes, we were mekabel on ourselves and on our children. His words are halacha. Let's do one final one. We'll do one final one. There's so much more. We could go on for 3 days and 3 nights and speak about so many interesting tshuvas in the Teshuvah Me'ava, but there's one fascinating tshuva that he has in Chelik Beis, in Ilchos Pesach. Again, Pesach's coming up, so we could mention this. And then he repeats it again by yard sites, because the minig is to fast on yard sites. And there are some who pater their fasting with siyumim, just like Bechorim and Bechor. Are you Nachi? You're Bechor?
Yeah.
You're Bechor. So, yes, so us Bechorim, we have the privilege of, having to make some sort of way to get out of the siyum on Erev Pesach. I actually saw a very interesting Maratarna. The Maratarna, the Sefer Minhagim, he says, very interesting point. Why do we try to get out of this fast? So the Maratarna says, very interestingly, that the custom of the Goyim is to fast, I guess in his days, was to fast the day before of the day before their holiday. So Mamela, we also, if we could do that, let's say Erev Pesach, if we have a heter, we would try to do that, not to be medama ourselves to the goyim. So that's why we try to get out of the fast on Erev Pesach. This is what he says in the Sefer Minhagim. The minig of getting out of the getting out of the fast al yidei bris milah or pidyon ben is a very long-standing minig. Again, the Maratarno is from the end of the Rishonim. Like in the times of the Maril. So it's a very, very long-standing minig. So anyways, so over here in Siman Taf Ayin, in the Gilin of Magen Avram, he says like this. He talks about how the Magen Avram says that you could be mevatel the tainis al yidei sulas mila. And he says, Nirlanias daiti. Dafka mila einoi ro'ui lasais b'erev Pesach b'shvil habechor. He says it is definitely not proper to make a siyum to pater yourself as a bechor, especially the people who were there. They were not there at the beginning of the Pesach; they're only there for the end. So ayin sham b'shach. So he says for sure you cannot be mater for them, or the bechorim themselves, if they're making the siyum, they for sure also cannot be yotze with the siyum. And then he says like this. This is very interesting. Kadavina Talia. I remember when I was a small child. I asked my Rebbeim, Rabbeinu Hagodol Mari Segel, Landau, Nishmase Eden, asked the Heilige Noid Yehuda, the widespread going, the Maram Fishlus, who was actually the Ravid, if I could possibly make a Siyam Masechta on Erev Pesach. Why? He was a Bechor after a Nefel, and so therefore the custom is the minig is to fast. So he wanted to make a siyam. Umichu biyodi v'loy omru betama. They were moiche, and they didn't say any reason why. And not only that, v'gam nichris b'chutzois al pi bezdin. They made an announcement in the street of Prague. Meaning me from the Bezdin, Misha Oisa Suda Siyam Be'erev Pesach B'Shvil HaBechorim Hu Shaloi Al Pi HaRois Chachamim. That someone who patters himself with a Siyam Masechta from the Tainis Bechorim is Shaloi B'Ratzon Chachamim. And again, in Yeridei and Chela Gimel, Siman, again, the Siman that he quoted before, Reish Mem Vav, in the Shach Sivkon Chav Zayin, he brings the same thing about fasting for a yard site. He says like this. The Soif Mesechta Yeshar Miyat Ad Soif Shas HaKosher. That the Maramain says that you should, that not like the Shach, that you should leave it to a day that's proper. Even if he coincided his siyum with, he happened to finish on Erev Pesach, b'shvil ha-bechorim ha-cherim sheyoichlu etzloi, because of the other bechorim that will eat with him. Yeah. V'kasafti shama shenichutzis al pi pekudas mori v'rabi ha-goyin nishim b'tzir v'arabona bezdin ha-godol misha oisa suda siyo b'erev Pesach bein b'shvil atzmoi shu bechor mikol shekein b'shvil bechorim ha-cherim gam acharei mois mori v'rabi ha-goyin nishim osei edem nichres kein al pi harabona bezdin ha-godol. But maybe Ashach can. So he's saying over here that again he's repeating how the Noid Yehuda made a cruz, and he assered people from eating from a siyum. They should not make a siyum to pata themselves from the tainus of Erev Pesach. And he says kol shekain bechorim that are joining on, that were only there for the end of the Masechta for sure. Shaloi al pi das chachmei al-Torah. And he says after the Noid Yehuda was nifter, they made the cruz again to strengthen the point. And he says that the Maril says it also v'negeya to yard site, and he says doin minei kal v'chomer advorim hashto yom shemeis boy ov v'imay shetainis boy ein loy soid v'shorish b'gamora poiskem arishonim. For sure, it's usher to eat in the Sudasiyim. V'hi rai mehemna v'rani lazeh shcheni akorav imi ben achosi Choisni Hamora Godala Tzadik or Meir Sagogloga the Divrei Meir. Yes, and it's interesting to point out that the Teshuvah's Mariatz from the Talmud of Chasam Sofer in Chilik Al Chaim Siman Nun Beis, he says that the Chaim that the Chasam Sofer is a Talmud of Chasam Sofer. He says the Chasam Sofer also was very, very makbid not to be yoitze with a siyum he was a bechor to pater himself from Tainis Bechorim with a siyum. He said that he was very, very strong not to do that. And also the new sefer that just came out, they just reprinted it, Zusman Sefer, the
Et Sefer.
It's Sefer, but his Sefer I think is like Lekutei Beis Ephraim or something like that. He has Sefer Lekutei Beis Ephraim. He has like Chedushay Torah from the Chasam Sofer in the back. And Ois Chavtes, he says that the Baal HaChasam Sofer Hoyagam Kein Makbid Al Heter Zeh, not to be yoitze with a Sudasiyim. However, if you look in Yesod Yosef from the Shalom Eshiv, Rabbi Yosef Shalom Natanzen, he was Mekel by Siyim, and he says father also is Mekel Siyim. So I guess the custom follows that. But again, the Noid Yehuda and the Teshuvah Me'ava and the Chachmei Prague were very strong against this heter. So to sum up,
hopefully, if listeners are still listening at this point in the podcast, there's a lot of fascinating material. There's so much to talk about Teshuvah Me'ava, and the Teshuvah Me'ava, just two things to talk about now when we talk about the new edition of Mechonat Yaakov. One, the Teshuvah Me'ava simply was not available. The one that was available was, well, I'm looking at you, Moshe, in front of me with the original edition. It's beautiful. Prague, nice big sefer with nice font. However, photo offsets copies are not the same. The letters get created. It's a photocopy.
Yeah.
And that's number one. Number two, as you said, there were errors in the original because of the breadth and the width of the breadth of the Elazar Fleckles Teshuvah Me'ava's Maram HaKomis and his knowledge. So you had things that were mistakes. There was lacking Maram HaKomis. It wasn't done, there wasn't an index. It wasn't something that...
He actually does have an index. That's a very unique thing about the Teshuvah Me'ava. He was very makbid to make an index in all his svarim. He called it Mara Be'etzpa, and other svarim he called it others, Yad B'tshuva. He has an index, but again, it's an index.
Not a contemporary, right, correct. So thank you for the correction. But furthermore, there's that. So that's first of all, and that it's amazing, and we owe Yashkech to Machoneh Yaakov for publishing and for putting out this new edition of Teshuvah Me'ava. Additionally,
I want to point out that when over 100 years ago, in 1912, it was the first time they reprinted the Teshuvah Me'ava, and the Madarov and the Shemloya were enthusiastic and so excited about how the Teshuvah Me'ava was so inaccessible. They said, we've been seeing the Sefer quoted, and we've been mishtoikik to when we could finally see the words of this Heilige Sefer, and now we're being zeicha to reprinting, and they're so excited, and I feel that same excitement myself, even though I own the first edition.
I know from you've been asking me many friends since I was able to find out about this new Teshuvah Me'ava, especially once this plan came to fruition, when Machoneh Yaakov purchased the Ksav Yad from Gnazim, that new volume on Even Ezer that came up a year and a half, 2 years ago. And so I've been asked constantly, everybody at that point, I remember before that auction, let me back up. We're going to get to talk about the new volume of Even Ezer. So first of all, it's amazing that it's back in print, it's available, it's a nice, beautiful new edition, and so on. Additionally, the volume of Even Ezer is now out and published for the first time. But when Gnazim put that up at auction, there was, I know, a lot of people interested in purchasing that. And the number one thing for the Eilam HaTorah and people that knew Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, knew his Torah, was like, we hope someone purchases it that's going to print it and it will be available. It's always a concern, especially with manuscripts today. Is it going to fall into the hands of a private collector or a library? A library, it's going to be available to the public. A private collector will disappear. We don't know.
Especially private collectors, that they appreciate not publishing the manuscript so that it keeps the...
Let's not go there, because that is a terrible avla, and the Gedolim, I don't even want to know. I had a conversation once with such a collector. I asked him, what is Gadol X going to tell you? It's worth so much money. I have this sefer with Hagoy, this sefer. I said, what's that Gadol going to come with Shemaim? What's he going to tell you that you held on to the sefer and you refused to print it? First of all, I don't think it lowers the value, but you think that. And let's give full credit. Mechoneh Yaakov has other Sfarim and Kisvi, other things, and they do a beautiful job on many Sfarim. It's a huge schus.
Unimaginable.
Unimaginable to reprint Teshuvah Me'ava and include Even Ezer, which, by the way, Teshuvah Me'ava was languishing for decades and not being printed. So now this Chelik Even Ezer, so again, going back to that, so people kept asking me, who's going to print it? Lamaisa, Machon Tzedakah bought it, and because of that, they decided to print the Teshuvah Me'ava and the Even Ezer volume. We know about the Even Ezer volume. I'll let you talk about it from the Teshuvah Me'ava. We know about it. I remember the Orach Chaim, Hyman Michael, I know everyone calls him Chaim Michel, but it's Hyman Michael, the German bibliographer and major book collector. He talks about it. He references it. Chelik Dalet in his Sefer Arim. It's referenced in others farm. We know it existed, this Chelik Dalet. So now, Baruch Hashem, it's seeing the light of day and it's being published for the first time.
So it's actually not a surprise to us that there's such a thing that existed in the past. It's not such a surprise to us that this existed because we have reference to it in the Teshuvah Me'ava. One example is in Siman Taf Mem Daled, in the Gilyon of the Shulchan Aruch, he makes reference to this Teshuvah Me'ava on the Gilyon of the Beis Shmuel and Even Ezer, and Siman Kuf Chavav, Sifkatan Aleph, which we hope to see Be'ezer Hashem soon, where he talks about the topic of if he forgot to sell his chametz, if he has a designated room, what could he do? If he could give him matana. He says to look over there in the Beis Shmuel and his Hagah over there. So we are very looking forward to this a new piece of Torah that I'm sure many Gedolim, V'toivim, Dayonim, Rabbonim are going to have so much hana from it. Probably going to, it might very much well change the face of, Even Ezer, Ksuvas, Gittin, Kedushin. We're very much looking forward, and we hope to, Be'ez Hashem, be zeicha to be nene from the or of the Teshuvah Me'ava very soon.
And finally, to just emphasize, Teshuvah's farm in general, as you just mentioned, they're something that are used and enjoyed by Rabbonim and Paiskim and Balei Halacha and so on. In fact, the Teshuvah Me'ava is a sefer, hopefully, that was illustrated throughout here, especially with this new edition. It can be enjoyed by anyone. You could just pull out, you can read it anytime. There's such fun, wonderful Teshuvahs in there that are enjoyable just to go through. Everything that he wrote is very well written. So stay tuned for the third episode where we'll dive into his other farm, Avos David, of course, which is exciting. That's the most Haggadah and the Malachas HaKodesh, but of all those, right, Avos David will spend the most time. And the other one, I really could use his own episode even, but the other ones are all just, we'll just mention them. I can go over every drush and so on. And thank you, Rabbi Moshe, for joining me on the podcast to talk about Fleckles and Teshuvah Me'ava.
A privilege for being on this.